Order. Can I welcome everyone to this session of the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry into Islamophobia. We had decided to and announced that we would conduct this inquiry some time ago as part of our work on hate crime. Obviously, that was before the awful terrorist attacks that we have seen in Christchurch, as well as some of the evidence about rising hate crime and Islamophobia here and elsewhere across the world as well. But we've also since then seen considerable work being done by the APPG on Islamophobia as well, on how to respond. So we look forward to taking evidence on all of these issues and also from political parties, as our predecessor committee did in their inquiry into anti-Semitism as well. Today's focus is on the definition of Islamophobia. But before I start, I just want to, in the month of Ramadan, also wish for all of those who are observing Ramadan Kareem as well. Can I ask our panel to each introduce themselves? Trevor Phillips.
I'm Trevor Phillips. I'm a senior fellow at Politics Change. I'm chairman of Green Park company, a recruitment company.
I'm Kishwer Falkner. I am a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords. I think I'm the only Muslim parliamentarian in both houses who actually lived and grew up in the Muslim world, in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So I came here as an adult, and I chair a select committee.
I see Martin Hewitt.
I'm Martin Hewitt. I'm the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council.
Basu.
Morning, Neil Basu, Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations, and I'm the National Lead for Counter-Terrorism Policing.
Thank you very much. We have a series of questions we want to put to you, and I would say also don't feel the need to answer every question, in the many questions that we will put to you. But can I start by asking all of you what your response is to the APPG's definition of Islamophobia? And if I could start with AC Neil Basu.
So you'll have seen it's unfortunate that it's become a matter of public debate around both the MPCC and counter-terrorism policing's view of this. The whole point of that was a private conversation with the government where we wanted to make it clear, which is our professional duty, to advise governments on the implication of a strategic or policy decision on operational policing. So that was the point. The fact is, I think it's too broad. So there's a couple of things I absolutely agree with. The first is the work of the APPG. So I think we're trying to be very kind of clinical and logical about a very emotional issue. So do I think there is an issue with Muslims being discriminated against and rising hate crime? Absolutely. Do I think it's exponential? Absolutely. And I've been in front of this committee talking about some of the reasons why that would be the case. So I absolutely see the need for a definition. Do I agree with the term Islamophobia? I think it's become common parlance. Why would I seek a different term? So I have no issue whatsoever with the term. Do I think it needs defining because of the emotional resonance it has amongst some individual Muslims and some Muslim communities? Yes, I think it does. So I think the work was really valuable. I've read the report. I've read every word of the report twice, and I understand a lot of the detail in the report. But the conclusion in that one very brief sentence, I think, is far too wide. And I think it's too wide for a number of reasons. One of the things is it does conflate issues of race and religion. And I know the report itself says it's not intended to, but it just does. And it's also so broad that actually anybody who criticises insults, even in a democracy where it doesn't reach a criminal threshold, or satirises Islam, would be called out under that definition for being Islamophobic and racist. And the worst case scenario for me has actually already happened, which is precisely because I can't accept that definition. Policing has been accused of perhaps thinking that particularly the techniques that I use in countering terrorism are somehow Islamophobic or racist. And clearly I don't think that at all. I think the consequences amongst the tiny fraction of people I deal with in the Muslim community who are extremists or even terrorists would be able to use that definition to frustrate some of the powers of my officers. And that is a complex decision-making process where they are making very rapid decisions anywhere. You know, it's not sitting here with all this finery on. It's a PC at an airport strip at 10 o'clock at night. It's a PC walking into a community hall in Bradford to deliver a prevent lecture. It is those kind of incidents which will be criticised by certain individuals because of the breadth of that report. That's what I was concerned about. So I would see, and I'm absolutely with Lord Carlisle here, where actually a slightly tightened definition with a code of practice about how it would be applied, I think that makes perfect sense. And actually there's an awful lot of work in the APPG document itself which could have been used to do that.
Okay. I think we want to pursue those issues further, but first of all, Assistant Constable Hewitt.
So not wishing to repeat everything that Neil has said, and obviously you would understand that we've spoken at great length prior to me writing the letter. The first point is that I absolutely accept there is a need for a definition of this issue. If I look at it from particularly the hate crime perspective within policing, the majority of hate crime offences that are recorded currently are against the Muslim community, and I absolutely understand the concern and in some cases the fear that is felt within Muslim communities. So I am entirely supportive of the work to try and arrive at a definition that we can all collectively work to. I think in seeking to find a definition that is a very short definition, it lacks some of the specificity that I would want in relation to officers on the ground applying this definition and using this definition in the work that they do day in, day out to protect the Muslim community and deal with any offences that are committed against that community. We have guidance that sets around how we deal with hate crime. What I want us to try and get to is a definition that is something that can be very complementary to that work that we do and to our guidance, and can be a definition that can be understood and used practically by police officers as they go about their business attempting to protect communities. And one of the issues, therefore, for me, is where we have some inconsistencies with the existing legal framework, with some of the language that's used in the definition. But I suspect we'll get into talking a bit about that. And again, I think some additional detail about precisely explaining that definition so it is understandable to everybody would be really helpful. But we have to start from a point, and I absolutely accept the work that's been done in the report and the point there that this must be a definition that is recognised by the Muslim community as a definition that reflects the issues that they feel they are facing. What I want us to try and get to is a definition that equally is applicable in the policing context for officers as they're going around and fulfilling their duties in protecting that community.
Ms. Falkner.
So I come from a position where I think it's actually very difficult to arrive at a definition which is collectively, as Mr. Hewitt has said, agreed by everybody. I mean, we are such a diverse community, Muslims. We're diverse not only in our geographical representation, but in our understanding of the theology. There are 4 strands of Sunni Islam, 3 strands of Shia, various permutations of how you interpret in the middle, liberalism, fundamentalism, and so on. So I think the idea that collectively the Muslims in the United Kingdom will come to a view of a definition, a one-size-that-fits-all, is first of all flawed. Secondly, I have profound problems with the APPG's definition. I think it's way too wide. My first objection is that it's very wide, and we can pick that up. My second objection is that it is, unlike what has been said since the report was published, it is meant to be legally binding. If you read it, the report, consistently, page after page, I think I read 22 examples of where people whose evidence was quoted approvingly said they needed this in law, they needed codified, or that it would be. Mr. Anas Sarwar, MSP, thought it would be law. All his evidence refers to the kind of law it should be. So they say that it wouldn't be legally binding. I find grave problems with the application of this kind of definition in law. And then the final thing I would say is that the expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness are extremely challenging. So you have Anna Soubry on Friday night on Radio 4, and I give you a direct quote, described it as, she said, we often talk of Englishness, everything from the way they dress, how they worship, and how they live their lives. Presumably they is Muslims, us. It covers everything, she says. Well, if it covers everything, it is impossible to narrow it down. So on the one hand, it's too wide. On the other hand, people want it to be rather narrow if they want it codified. And I can say that Professor Tahir Abbas, one of the contributors, identifies 12 types: crime, culture, gender, institutionalism, intellectual, media, political, religious, state, structural, xenophobia. We can expand on that. But to give an example, I think most people in the room would be caught by that, that in the political, he sees influential right-leaning and left-leaning thinkers are in denial of Islamophobia. Political, populism, nationalism, and neoliberalism deriving mass public sentiment. Well, some people think the EU is a neoliberal project, so presumably that's an Islamophobic project. So there's a clear lack of focus and clarity in the APPG's report on which the definition is based. So it's very difficult to think of the definition without what the report set out to do.
To some of those issues in more detail shortly, but just to clarify, is your view that we should not attempt to have a definition, or is your view simply that you're not comfortable with this definition?
So I think that there are a couple of things that need to be done in the law and order arena. There are a couple of things we need to do, waiting for the Law Commission report on online hate crime and Islamophobia and what's to be done there. And I think you have to look at across the range at what the problem is that attempting to define Islamophobia is intended to solve. Once you arrive at what the problem is, then you can decide whether you need a definition or whether you need some instruments in law to help the job of law enforcement easier when they're dealing with hate crime. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not here to speak for law, but I should just say that that it appears pretty unenforceable to me as I look at it.
Trevor Phillips.
Thank you very much, Chair. If you would indulge me at the start, I'd like to start on a personal note. I was born in London, but I was raised in Guyana, which is a multi-racial country with a large Muslim population, which is in itself multi-racial. The Mandinka and Fulani slaves that were brought to British Guyana in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries would have been Muslims. The earliest non-Arab converts were in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Almost certainly the only reason that my own family is not Muslim today is because we were slaves. In our case, we very likely belong to the family of the former Prime Minister, William Gladstone. So to be frank, I imagine that we only became Christians because the Gladstones whipped the Islamic faith out of us. So I do have some idea what a hatred of Islam and a fear of Muslims can do. Islam has now arrived in British Guyana again with South Asians. My neighbours and schoolmates were practicing Muslims. I celebrated Eid and Yuman Nabi, which is what we call the Prophet's birthday, as public holidays with the same stature as Christmas and Easter. And Guyana is now a member of the Organisation for Islamic Cooperation. One of my sisters is a Muslim convert. So the position of Muslims has always been close to my heart. And that's part of the reason why, as chair of the Runnymede Trust back in 1997, I commissioned the report that introduced the term Islamophobia to the UK. So why would I object to what is now being put forward? Here are some reasons. First of all, it adds nothing to our legal or practical ability to protect Muslims from violence and distress. Secondly, it makes no attempt to address the principal causes of Muslim disadvantage, which are employment discrimination, educational failure, and if we are concerned about violence, the principal cause of death amongst young Muslim men in this city is knife crime. It confuses race and religion to the detriment of British Muslims by limiting reasonable adjustments, and we can talk a little bit more about that if you would like. It does aim to bring in legal change. One of the earliest things in the report is a criticism of the 1997 Runnymede Trust report for not creating a definition with legal transferability. So the purpose of this is unambiguous. It is only meaningful as a piece of work, working definition it's called, if it narrows the scope for freedom of expression And one thing which I think has not been commented at all on so far is that in practice it creates two different standards of speech for Muslims and non-Muslims.
That's right.
Who can say what? And finally, again, a point that has not been raised, it will, I'm sure this is unintended, it will introduce consequences for employees and public authorities who must be required to treat people of other religions and beliefs in the same way as this definition would suggest.
Stuart MacDonald.
My colleagues are going to ask, obviously, quite a lot about the detail of the definition itself, but if I could just, as a starting point, revisit the question of whether we need a new definition at all. Both Assistant Commissioners, you have said that you welcome this, or a new definition, but just not this particular one. Why do you both feel that we need a new definition of Islamophobia?
I think there has been, over a number of years now, an emerging sense of the Muslim community in this country feeling under attack in a range of different ways. If you look specifically at hate crime figures, then that is a rise, and there is a very clear rise in the hate crime figures. And as I said in my opening commentary, the Muslim community features in the majority in that. We have seen particular spikes after events, so after the EU referendum, after the terrorist events in 2017, very considerable spikes. There's an enormous amount of work that's done in policing to engage with the Muslim community in order to understand the fears of that community, to protect those communities. And, as has already been said by Trevor and Baroness Falkner, there are a whole range of other issues of disadvantage that I think the Muslim community would point to. So from a very purely policing perspective, I think it is really important that we recognise the fact that this particular group of people in our country face a range of disadvantages, but as I say, from my perspective, particularly the range of hate crime. And it would be important then for everyone in society, for government, for all departments and for all agencies, including the police, to have a definition that we can utilise. And again, as I said at the beginning, equally important for those people who are Muslims in this country to feel that that issue is recognised and is being addressed.
The definitions of Islamophobia, the term we've heard originated or was introduced around 1997, and there have been various other attempts since then to come to a definition. Why has our police forces not already done this work to find a definition that works for them?
Well, we have definitions, and we, as you might imagine, use the legal definitions that exist within hate crime. And the 2001 amendment of the Crime Disorder Act, which was the original hate crime legislation, introduced religiously motivated hate crime. And we work to the guidance in terms of dealing specifically with hate crime. We work to that guidance. So in that sense, I think we don't lack a definition in that sense. I think the broader requirement for a definition for me seems to be for everybody to accept the range of issues and challenges that are faced by the Muslim community in this country, and for all departments, all parts of government, and for society to recognise that, and as I say, importantly for the community themselves to recognise that we are recognising that and being able to describe it. And I think there is a parallel with the anti-Semitism definition and the work that was undertaken there and the impact that has had in terms of recognising that particular form, in my world, of hate crime.
No, in your answer, you've obviously sort of set out some of your criticisms of this particular definition, but at some points you also seem to suggest that a collective definition is impossible. What do you think of the earlier definitions that have existed about Islamophobia? Are you saying that there isn't any use in this term at all?
No,
Sure.
I didn't want to leave you with that impression. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to clarify that. The report identifies some useful avenues. On page 24, Eric Blyke, an academic who I worked with in the past, gives a definition which is that it's an indiscriminate negative attitude or emotions directed at Islams or Muslims. But he qualifies that by giving examples of what would be Islamophobia, what wouldn't. So, for example, if you were living in a country which practices female FGM and you directed your criticism at people who are carrying out FGM, that wouldn't be Islamophobia, whereas, because that's some Muslim communities in some circumstances do that kind of thing. But if you condemned all Muslims as a whole for being pro-FGM, then that probably would be. So I think, there are avenues that one can explore, certainly in terms of clarifying the law. There is another, the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where I have quite a lot of experience because I was the UK's nominee to be the High Commissioner on minorities there. They have quite a good definition. They don't use the term Islamophobia, which I myself am uncomfortable about, and I'm on the record in the Lords for saying that more than once. But they say anti-Muslim bias. And actually the bias part, I myself would have used anti-Muslim hatred, but I accept that hatred is narrower than bias. Hatred perhaps doesn't encompass, the threshold is high, and it doesn't encompass as many things as you might wish to capture in a definition. So anti-Muslim bias in that sense would open that out to more discretion as to what constitutes that particular hate crime. So one can be open to, so I think it's more this particular definition that I feel very reluctant to advocate is a good thing. But can I take you to the point of definitions per se? The anti-Semitism definition that we debated so much last year was intended to be a definition to help guide. It wasn't meant to be legal. 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, you've had the Minister for Education telling universities that they need to adopt it. Now, that clashes very directly with the public body of universities' obligation to protect freedom of speech. Now you have a government minister sitting there and saying, well, we never intended this actually to apply across the board, but actually I think universities should adopt it. So naturally, it's very interesting to see where this debate will go, but that will present real challenges for universities. So I think my other concern is that if you have a definition that you don't get absolute consensus on, and a definition which is challenging at the boundaries, that with mission creep and with the stated intention in the report that it should be legal, that you will get something that will come back to present you with far greater problems, create far greater division, and ultimately become another aspect of the culture wars that we have all around us right now.
Trevor, Phillips, similarly, so you have criticisms about this particular definition, but stepping back from that, your problem seems to be, you've obviously used and continue to use Islamophobia as a term and a word yourself, but it's this step about trying to make it some sort of legally enforceable term that you object to. Is that fair?
I object to many things in this. My point about the legal enforceability is that there's some question about whether the APPG report seeks a legal change or not.
The definition then, would you support a definition that can be used?
Can I just make one point of context? When we published the original report on Islamophobia, one thing was very different from today. There was no law on religious discrimination. That did not come in until 2006 in relation to goods and services, and then in 2010 the law on religious discrimination was harmonised with other protected grounds. When we wrote the report in 1997, it was really an effort to draw attention to what we saw as discrimination against Muslims. And the definition that we had in mind then was something very concrete and very simple. And actually, it's not a million miles away from something that I saw the Shadow Home Secretary put out yesterday, which is pretty simple. I think she says these are acts of bias, here we go, acting in a biased or discriminatory way against anyone on the basis that they are or perceived to be a Muslim. There's no reference to speech or expressions of Muslimness. It's specifically about acts, and it is about the act against individuals. And that is what we had in mind when this was originally coined. The truth is, if we had had the 2006 Act and the 2010 Act, I don't imagine actually much of what we said in that report would have been relevant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I pick up that point, please, Trevor Phillips? Because I met a number of members of the Muslim community in Greater Manchester last month with Afzal Khan, and I must say they both welcomed the concept of having a definition and did welcome the definition that the APPG is putting forward. But I was interested in the point you were making about we already have an existing legislative framework in relation to religious discrimination, and Martin Hewitt mentioned in relation to aggravated hate crime. I have to say, since I've been the Member of Parliament for Stretford and Ernston since 2010, by which time we had this legislation, and I represent an ethnically mixed community with a high Muslim population in one part of it, that they have never been satisfied with that legislation. They don't feel it does afford a strong enough legal framework. Why do you think they might be concerned about that, and what would be your response to that? I'm probably interested in hearing from Trevor or Martin.
Well, I suspect that actually what they're dissatisfied with is the execution or the enforcement of legislation. I would be very surprised, to be frank, if most people knew much about the actual legislation. There are a number of points made in the APPG report about specific cases. Now, I've been through it rather carefully. If you leave aside the things that I think myself that most British Muslims are most concerned about, which are to do with employment and discrimination and so on, maybe even a hostile climate at the far right, and you focus on the issues raised by the APPG, which really are about religiously motivated and politically motivated and sometimes criminally motivated violence. I mean, the truth is, actually, if you look at the law, we have instruments. They are called harassment, they are incitement, they are assault. And in almost every single case that I've been able to look at, those are the legal instruments that have been used to protect people. So I have no doubt that people say what you say, but I suspect what they are more talking about is the extent and effectiveness of the enforcement of the existing law.
So the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners have said that a definition would ensure that incidents were taken seriously and that there was consistency and clarity in the way in which the police, for example, would deal with them. Do you agree with that?
I have no idea how they arrive at that conclusion.
So you don't agree with it?
I don't really see how one could reach that. The point of a definition, why would that make police officers enforce the existing law more consistently?
Yes, I don't think I agree with that assertion. The law, I think, is very clear, both in terms of racially and religiously aggravated offences. And I think it is important to point out that in many cases where a Muslim is a victim of an offence, it may well be racially as well as religiously motivated if they're a person from a minority ethnic group. So I think I tend to agree with Trevor, and I obviously don't understand specifically the concerns of your constituents, but I suspect it's less about the legislative framework and more about their sense that this is an issue that is taken seriously. Well, I can absolutely say that hate crime is an issue that is taken seriously by the police. You can see that in the level of rises in the recording of hate crime that we have seen over the last number of years. There is very clear guidance for police officers how to enforce that law. I absolutely accept, and particularly I suspect in offences that are not physical assaults, that are the lower level, that kind of very insidious and hurtful and harmful offences that people suffer, that it is difficult to get successful prosecutions. It is difficult in those circumstances, and I think we would all understand that. But I don't think the definition as currently formed would impact necessarily on the way that the police operate, and that's one of my key issues around this. Is what I want is a definition that absolutely supports and reinforces the work that we are doing. And I know definitively the amount of work that goes on in Greater Manchester in your constituency to deal with all minority communities, and that's been something that the police have put an enormous amount of effort in. So, and that, in a sense, is part of my point with the definition. Is I don't think it does enhance where we are, and what I want is something that does provide that greater clarity for the officer who is out there now dealing with these issues as they are reported.
Inconsistencies between the framework that your officers are working to now and the APPG definition. Could you tell us what some of those inconsistencies are?
I guess the key one for me is that the current definition twice defines the issue as racist and uses that term. And I absolutely understand the kind of common use of the word racist and why the community feel that describes what they are suffering. And as I say, in some cases, there will no doubt be a racist motivation in the perpetrator because the person that they are abusing or assaulting is a person from an ethnic minority. But that is not the case for all Muslims, and often the offence will be religiously motivated. In other words, the person perceives or recognises the person to be of the Muslim faith. And of course, in our legislation, to be a Muslim is not a race in our legal system as it currently stands. And I think it is unhelpful to have that inconsistency between the law around what is currently defined as a race and then describing any action against a prejudiced action against a Muslim being racist. I understand the term. I understand why the term is a strong term, but I feel that inconsistency is unhelpful. I need to be really clear that it would not stop the police doing what we do and applying the law as we apply the law. But what I would be seeking is to get a definition that fits more consistently with the legislation.
Can I just say something very briefly? I'll give you a real-life example. A very close relative of mine recently had an attack that could have been defined as both Islamophobia and racism. And this was in a supermarket in London only a couple of weeks ago. So it's not... So when you get a large majority, I don't know the exact figure, I suspect it's in the high 90s, of Muslims in the UK being visibly different, as some of us are, then there is confusion. You know, when my relative said to me, what shall I report to the police? I suggested that she report it as both an Islamophobic and a racist attack.
And it would be recorded as such as well. We will often record as both motivation.
So what I thought it was, I hope that the criminal justice system would identify as well what it was in law.
Well, it would in law, but the law also states that it's the perception of the victim or any other person. And that's a really important point, that the victim or any other person who's with the victim is able to assert what they think the motivation was in that particular instance.
That's a really interesting point. Do you think people would be inhibited from making an assertion that it was both on the grounds of their faith and their race as a result of the APPG definition?
No, I don't think it would have that. I don't think that. And if I'm honest, I think when someone who is a victim is not necessarily thinking those legal terms, they will describe what has happened to them. And I think we have the legal framework with which to deal with that, and we will record it accordingly.
May I just add a fact that might be helpful? I don't entirely, I'm sure we'll return to the issue of race and religion and the IHRA definition. I don't myself entirely buy this parallel. But if you want to consider that, if you look at the Community Security Trust website, they have a list of prosecutions that took place for anti-Semitic violence, the kind you're talking about. And if you look at the 10 prosecutions that they list in the second 6 months of last year, they were all under public order, sending threatening communications, and some, and assault, and a few of them were racially or religiously aggravated. But actually, the go-to piece of legislation to deal with this kind of thing are usually public order, assault, threatening communications, and very occasionally something that's racially aggravated.
Basu, if I can just ask you a couple of questions. Firstly, when you said at the very outset that the definition would then need to command the respect of the communities, if I'm right in saying. I myself come from a Muslim background. My father was an imam, grandfather was an imam, and uncles were imams. And so you understand the community a fair bit. But when it comes to this, I want to be fair. So I've not come to a conclusion on this as yet. I want to hear both sides before you make that judgment. With regards to the procedure that's followed, with regards to this definition that's come forward from the APPG, and your work on community engagement in tackling extremism and terrorism, and a lot of those incidents are thwarted with work with community engagement. In your work, you work with the Muslim communities across the board on all different sects of the Muslim community, is that right? And across the United Kingdom?
Yes.
And your engagement with all the different sects of the Muslim community that you've had so far, what is their view of the definition that we have at the moment?
Well, that's an interesting point, because I haven't reached a conclusion either, because I wasn't consulted on it. And it's interesting, about a year ago, about 15 months ago, when I set up the CT Advisory Network, which is a kind of independent advisory group, not just from the Muslim community, because please don't see the lens of counter-terrorism just through Islamist jihadist terrorism. It is I've been here before talking about that is currently the greatest threat, but we have a rising amount of extreme right-wing terrorism threat in this country, and we are dealing with that. And all the powers and policies we bring to bear, I would describe as ideologically agnostic. It doesn't make any difference what the terrorism is. We need to use these powers against it. So we haven't been consulted, and in fact I've asked for the Muslim members of the advisory group to meet me on Thursday so that we can discuss this. So, and you know, I take some responsibility. You know, a year ago when the APPG first set up its work, I was knee-deep dealing in Salisbury. So I did not recognise that this was going to be potentially a CT issue back in March 2018. And up until that point, the APPG, to my knowledge, didn't consult with the national leads on either CT, race and faith, or hate crime. So there were some police officers who gave evidence, but I wouldn't describe that as the national voice of policing. So I think we've come to this a bit late. So I'm not saying I've made a conclusive point. But when I do look at that, the breadth of that definition, and I listen to Lord Carlisle, who spent 10 years as an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation and was a constructive critic of that legislation, and he's telling me that prevent and pursue as government policy could be affected by this, I have to take that seriously. I've got a professional responsibility. But can I just say, I think this is all about community confidence. We've had a long debate here about the criminal interpretation. So I've heard what the APPG chairs have said over the last couple of days. This is not meant to be a legal definition. I'm with the Baroness. When you look through the report, everyone who gave evidence thought it was going to be a legal definition. And professionally, I have to think, what would be the consequences of it being a legal definition? But actually, I come down, and I'm really conflicted about this. This is a definition that was designed to protect people like me. So I've spent 51 years dealing with racism, and the vast amount of racism I've had in my life has been the perception that I might be Muslim, and I'm not. So I look at that, and I feel kind of personally conflicted about saying I can't accept this definition. But professionally, for me, it's about community confidence. And I think a lot of those communities will feel that not accepting this without any question has reduced their confidence in me, and I'm horrified by that.
This question, just clarification on that, and I get that. And I start from the point, yes, of course. I prosecuted cases before and defended before I came to this place. Of course there is hatred towards people of different faiths, and Muslim community face that. And as you said, Mr. Hewitt, that I think you used the word Muslim communities feeling under attack. I take every word as a meaning. It's not the Muslim communities feeling under attack. Muslim communities are under attack because the reality is, as you said, by far the largest amount of incidents affect that community. So words have meaning on that. But coming back to you, Assistant Commissioner, and I just want to get the answer, just come back to you on that. The answer on that, if I may just clarify, is, if I could get some clarification on that, confidence with the widespread Muslim community. What I'm trying to get to is the definition that we have before us. There is no unanimous support for it from the different diverse Muslim communities across the United Kingdom. That's the question I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to get to the point, sorry. So from your experience, when you engage with different Muslim communities from across the United Kingdom, we have an organisation, the APPG, has come up with a definition. But the point I'm trying to get from you as an expert who engages with the Muslim communities, that definition does not have a cross-spectrum support from the Muslim community. Am I right in thinking that or not?
Yes, and that's what makes this difficult, but you don't need my evidence there. I think 40 Muslim academics wrote back around this definition and said, we don't accept it. Baroness Falkner is here as a secular Muslim saying she doesn't accept this definition. So it is absolutely evident. And I think that's the problem with this APPG report. It was designed to do two things, I think. One was to, quite rightly, protect the Muslim communities and give them some confidence that we all understand discrimination and hatred is real, and we do. I've not heard anyone say anything other than that. But it's also designed to be a broad consultation which reached broad agreement. I don't think it achieves either of those two things, and that's the problem. And your question is absolutely apposite, which is it hasn't achieved broad consensus amongst the very community that it was trying to protect. But I've certainly had some very strong feedback that people are unhappy that we wouldn't unquestioningly accept this. And that's because this is about emotion, it's not just about the logic. In terms of what Martin has said, the way we investigate hate crime and anti-Muslim hate crime won't change whether this definition exists or not.
And the point I make on that, from extremism and terrorism and treating communities fairly, you will know I pushed forward previously to get the terminology changed from using the word Islamic State to Daesh, because day in, day out, using that phrase would then link people's peaceful, great faith with a terrorist organisation, which people had tried to do, and therefore it was right to address the terminology so that people's faith was not linked to that organisation, so to address the issue of intolerance being created out there and the perception of that. So it's absolutely right to get the terminology right at that stage. So I've been very clear to ensure that we have to do everything we can to deal with hatred, but the procedure has to be followed, and that's why I come to you, if I can, Mr. Phillips, is when you said earlier about the definition of anti-Semitism, and now you have this new definition by the APPG. One has to be fair in treating all faith communities fairly. The procedure that was followed before one got to the definition of anti-Semitism, was this the same procedure that was followed before the definition has arisen at what is Islamophobia? Because if you're going to make one quite clearly a defined wording, then on that basis you have to then follow the same procedure when you come to this wording. But let me come to you in a minute, Baroness Falkner, but from Mr. Phillips, because I think if you're going to have definitions, you have to follow the same procedure. Has same procedures been applied on this or not? From your
No. I mean, the history of the IHRA definition and its purpose was completely different. Let's leave aside the question about whether you're talking about equivalence, which I don't think you are, to be absolutely frank. Muslims are a billion-wide global, multi-racial, multi-ethnic communities. Jews are something quite different, and in our law, they are also a race. So the equivalence that's being imposed on this seems odd to me. But to answer your question directly, may I say a word about where the IHRA definition came from? It was drafted in 2003 by a body of the Council of Europe, the European Union Monitoring Centre. The Commission for Racial Equality, of which I became chair in that year, was the UK contact point. The reason that it was drafted was for none of the reasons we've been discussing today. It was entirely to do with identifying what historical events would be defined as anti-Semitic and would be essentially marked on International Holocaust Day and in museums and so on. It was entirely to do with that. The European Union Monitoring Centre members and steering group committees, which I was a member, looked at it and said, in effect, this doesn't particularly help us in our work of dealing with discrimination. So that the definition sat on the website of the EUMC for, I think, 5 or 6 years. The EUMC was replaced in 2007 by a European Union agency called the Fundamental Rights Agency, which then dropped it. It has only come back into public debate since 2015-16, and it came as a result of an international negotiation and discussion. So the background to this is completely different, and that's why when you ask, did it follow the same process? No, because the purpose is different and the origins are different.
I totally understand that, but the procedure that was applied and the work that took to get to the definition with anti-Semitism, in terms of the research that followed, was a quite in-depth kind of process. Am I right in saying, in relation to the definition that we've just come to now with Islamophobia, in how it's been reached? That's what I'm trying to get to.
Well, I don't think so, really. I mean, there's no doubt that effort will have gone into both things, but they are completely... What I'm resisting is the idea that these are two similar processes, because actually their origins are completely different and their purposes were completely different.
Just to come back, if I may, on that. Totally understand where you're coming from. What I'm trying to get to is we are in a process where if we look at the word extremism, we haven't even come to a definition of extremism yet. The Counter-Terrorism Commissioner is working on where the threshold is drawn. The same point I'm making with this is, of course, the origins are different. But the procedure, if you're going to have a confidence in a definition that's come forward, if it's gone through a process and rigour to get to a point where you have a definition at the end which is respected by all, then on that same process, my question to you is, I'm not making a statement, has this gone through that, taking into account the different views that have been put forward?
Well, if what you want to do is apply a metric of numbers of people consulted, length of time taken, stages, then this definition has not gone through a fraction of that the IHRA went through. I mean, it hasn't, for example, been considered at any international forum as far as I know. And the IHRA was considered over a period, I would guess, of about 8 years internationally before it wasn't accepted. So, but the point I understand exactly what you're trying to get me to do, but I think the point here is, wouldn't it be better to start thinking, why do we need this definition? Because the comparison with the IHRA illuminates that point. The IHRA definition came into being for a very different purpose. It is not used in the same way as the APPG would like this definition to be used. And I can go through that in aching detail if you want.
I'm not going through that with you. What I was trying to clarify is, and I'm not one of those that say you have to go through 8 years because the other process has gone through 8 years. Not at all. But what I'm trying to say is the procedure to make sure the rigour, the definition that you have, has the support at the end. So that's the clarification. Let me move on, if I may. Assistant Commissioner, can I just ask you this point? And it comes down to the issue on freedom of speech, which is being said. So I've got here I've got a letter here from the Commissioner for Countering Extremism. A definition can help provide clarity and help us better challenge anti-Muslim hatred. The far right exploit the lack of understanding of anti-Muslim prejudice to propagate hatred, which they disguise as free speech. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, others would say, one of the major objections to the definition is that it would impact on freedom of speech and lead to legitimate discussion, debate and criticism being deemed Islamophobic. With those two different statements that you have, the question is this: how can a balance be struck between enabling legitimate debate and protecting people from attack?
Very good question. So the threshold test, because those two statements are clearly not mutually exclusive. We live in a country which is a liberal democracy in which free speech is absolutely valued. I've said it before, freedom of speech is not an absolute right. It doesn't mean freedom to harm. But who sets that threshold test? That's not for policing to set that test. It's for society to set that test. And depending on who you are and what you're experiencing at that time, you will think that test is either far too high or far too low. What it certainly has had, and we've seen this, we've seen the effect of post-referendum, post-terrorist attack, of all ideologically driven type attacks, spikes in crime, and uses of those attacks to spread disinformation, which wouldn't necessarily be a criminal offence, but certainly has resulted in increases in hate and hate crime. So the point being is, you do have to have freedom of speech, you do have to really test the thresholds, you do have to have a very clear point at which that becomes a criminal test. And having something vague and ambiguous that doesn't do that is not helpful to either side of that debate, in my view.
Just final question to you, Baroness Falkner. With regards to the definition, I accept there needs to be a definition. As to what that is, that's where the discussion needs to go, and one needs to look at the evidence. From your point, just touching on the point you raised earlier, from where we are with this definition to a definition that you will feel comfortable with, where would that be?
Before I go there, could I pick up the thread that you were speaking to Trevor Phillips about, please? I think that to draw a moral equivalence between the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe and the current state of anti-Muslim hatred and bias in Europe is a profound mistake. And coming back...
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
I wasn't drawing that.
Yeah.
What I was trying to draw... No, let me finish before you go down that. What I was trying to say is the procedure that was followed. It was on that, not that.
So I'll come to the procedure. So the Stockholm Declaration, where the origins of that lie, as Trevor Phillips tried to explain, which was an international attempt to arrive at a definition, starts with, and I quote, "With humanity still scarred by anti-Semitism and xenophobia, the international community shares a solemn responsibility to fight those evils." This was seen in the context of the people who were survivors of the Holocaust, dying, young people growing up and not understanding their history, and this was an attempt on the part of the international community to try and keep that history alive. So I think that's quite important to say. Coming to the process, because I've critiqued the process, I think, in the submission I made. I've been dealing with this issue for 25, since the Satanic Verses, I've been dealing with the issue. And I have interacted with Muslim academics around the world, as well as in the United Kingdom. What struck me about many of the academics who gave evidence to this inquiry, and I know a lot of them, by the way, I've dealt with them. Sometimes I've endorsed their books, some other times I haven't. But what struck me about the academics who were consulted, they're of a particular kind of sociological thinking, critical theory, left-leaning perspective, that a structuralist perspective, forgive me, I'm going to go into some political science expressions, but they were perfectly good people. There was Madhawi al-Rashid, the professor of theology at King's, who's now at LSE. There was Samina Ahmed, a professor of sociology at King's. There's Rumi Hassan, who I think is in Sussex. There was, above all, somebody who wrote the most significant contemporary critique, not a critique, a book about the crisis of Islamic civilization. Madhawi,
can I just ask?
Ali Alawi, the former Justice Minister of Iraq.
So
there were plenty of people you could have.
Baroness, can I just ask? I get that, and you've given a submission on that. I'm pressed for time because I've got to ask a few more. Can I just ask that?
The process wasn't followed.
No.
Of course it is.
I'm not asking you about the process. My question to you was with regards to the process I'd already dealt with, Trevor Phillips, because I said the definition for anti-Semitism was absolutely spot on and the procedure was absolutely right, and I was just trying to compare it on that. Okay. My question to you was, briefly, the definition, from where we are with the APPG definition to where you would like to do, in a nutshell, where would you say would be the right definition on this? Okay, so the report itself gives several definitions, it lifts them out. I think the Open Society, the one I would prefer most would be the OSCE, which the report doesn't touch on. The next one was Professor Eric Bleich, another one was Open Society Institute. Crown Prosecution Service has its own definition. I think there were some that one could live with as long as they were not legally enshrined. If you want a legal definition, then I suggest that government tasks the Law Commission to do a very separate, comprehensive piece of work on that.
On that point, if this is not a legal definition, can you live with it?
No, because...
Just clarify, because there's been a lot of...
Okay,
you've answered. Thank you, Baroness Falkner. I just want to hear from the rest of the panel. Because some of your objections seem to be tilting at it being a legal definition. If it was made very clear that it was not to be a legal definition, could you live with it?
I still think, I think it added some specifics in support of the one sentence or the two sentences. As I've said, the way that we operate, particularly within hate crime, will carry on and we operate against the law. But what I really want us to get to is a definition that is really impactful and meaningful. And I think with some more detail, that would be possible from the policing context.
So no, not for me, because it'll never get away from the fact that it's too broad, and that it'll never get away from the fact that it does close down any form of debate or criticism. And if you believe in free speech, that, and I'm concerned about what that does and what that drives underground. So actually, it doesn't matter whether somebody's going to get prosecuted for it. It may well stop people reporting on it. It may well stop people reporting to us on it. So I'm concerned about that. So it's too broad. So.
In conclusion, they have a whole series of examples and make very clear that they want to take the same approach as the IHRA definition with its explanatory notes and examples and contemporary examples, and they list a series. Is your concern with the detail of the examples, or is it with the kind of the initial definition? Because I'm not sure whether you're taking into account the examples as part of it when you say that.
So I don't think we're very far away at all. So when I look at a lot of the things that are written and quoted within the APPG report and that conclusion with those examples, that's what I'm talking about tightening up the definition. And I think that's kind of where, I'm not going to speak for him, but when I was reading what Lord Carlisle said, a code of practice that explained exactly what that meant and did give some very clear examples of what was meant by Islamophobia and what wasn't, would be really useful, and I could absolutely live with that, legal or not.
And the specific examples that the APPG use, if their examples and their explanatory notes that are in their conclusion were effectively added to the definition, it became the kind of the definition with the explanatory notes and with those examples. Would that be something that you think would work?
Can I just be clear about one thing? I don't think this is for policing to be involved in defining this. I think this is about people that it affects. So it is merely the operational effect of what we've got here. So I need to be really... Personally, I'd love to give you the definition I would be more comfortable with, but I don't think that's my place to do that. But what you've just described is something, yes, I would be prepared to sign up to. And I think there's a lot of... And that is what's closer to the IHRA work than just that simple one-liner that seems to have been devised to be it is a very bold and very clear and very quick statement. And I think and it has generated a lot of debate. And therefore, I can't live with that because actually it needs to be broadly accepted and isn't even by the communities that it seeks to protect. So I think with your caveats that you've described, that is what I wanted to be consulted on. So that's what I wanted to discuss, and I think, yes, that is somewhere to go. The one thing I think does need to be addressed is it isn't just about rooting in racism. I think it's rooting in prejudice and bigotry, and that's about anti-race and anti-religious feeling. I think the fact that it's rooted so clearly in racism, and I think others much more qualified than me have said why that's an issue.
May I make a point in response specifically to the question you've asked? The most important thing about this, whether it's legal or not, one of the things we have to remember is that a definition may be promulgated, but especially if it is not legally enshrined, it does not stay in the hands of the APPG. Other people are free to interpret it as they wish. And if I may, my old friend Anne Soubry sitting behind me, and she will remember this, at the beginning of the 1970s, the National Union of Students adopted a policy of no platform for fascists, and it was for a very specific purpose. It was to keep the National Front off campuses. Within 5 years, it had transmogrified into something quite different, including, by the way, no platforming Anna. So you weren't in the meetings that I was in. The point is this: the reason that the question of why I would object to it is that it won't stay in the confines set out in the mind of the APPG. And there's a specific example I want to give about why this is important. What happens with this definition is it gets adopted by an authority or an employer. The employer will then use it, and we've already seen this in case of one university, use it as a test for whether an individual says or does things that brings the university into disrepute. If it is thought that that individual has failed this test, legal or not, they will be fired, and that has happened.
It's still unclear to me whether that is an objection to the content of this particular definition or to having any definition at all?
It's an objection to the content.
So it's the specific definition, not to having any definition at all, because the way that you frame your answer suggests that it could be equally applicable to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because any definition on that basis could be used by different organisations and institutions in a way that is different from that intended by those who drafted the original version.
Yes, but if you draft... But the IHRA definition actually can't be used in that way. This one could.
Okay, so that's about the content rather than
because of the way it's written.
rather than the fact of having a definition. And just to confirm, just on this the issue about the examples. So I just wanted to clarify, if the examples that the APPG has put in its report and its conclusion were made more explicitly and formally or clarified as being part of the definition that they were proposing, then would that cause any challenges to you in terms of the policing issues that you have raised?
So I want to be clear and concise. I believe in a definition. I believe there needs to be a definition. I have no problem with the term Islamophobia at all. I think if it's defined in a way that doesn't allow people to misuse it in the way that Trevor has described, I would completely accept that. And I think some of the work in this conclusion is good. In fact, when I read it, I ticked every single one of their definitions.
So if you added all of them in, would that address all of your concerns?
Fundamentally, on a kind of point, I don't think that's for policing to do. But, you know, I didn't disagree with any of these definitions.
I think there is a debate to have to take the definitions that are existing there, which there's none there that I could disagree with, but I think if you have definitions that both exemplify what the definition is trying to say and also to a certain extent confine and explain what some of the terms in the definition are attempting to make, the points they're attempting to make, then I think you can reach a point. And that really would be, for me, I think the process is to work that up, to get something that is more comprehensive and, again, back to my original point, which is about it's then explainable and usable in an operational sense from my perspective.
I think it also needs to clarify what it's not.
Yeah,
so when I read the report, I couldn't, and I know APPG, both chairs have said it is not about restricting free speech or criticism, legitimate criticism of a faith. I think it needs to say that.
Tim Lawson.
It's become clear that there was no consultation from the APPG with senior police leads. I think there were 2 West Midland police officers who were included in one of the events. So can I come back to the counter-terrorism and extremism angle? And both Assistant Commissioners, I think, have gone on record as saying that you think it would seriously impede the ability of the police to deal with counter-terrorism. And I think, Mr. Phillips, you put that in your policy exchange report as well. That was described as breathtaking by Dominic Grieve in the debate on Thursday. So why do you think you're right and he's wrong?
So Dominic Grieve is a man I respect greatly and is a Queen's Counsel. I also respect Alex Carlisle, who is a Queen's Counsel. My point is I've got 2 eminent QCs who've got a great deal of knowledge about counter-terrorism and national security issues who both fundamentally disagree. And because I haven't consulted on this and I haven't reached a firm conclusion, it would be very wrong of me to not listen to the concerns of those 2 individuals. One is saying, breathtaking, no chance that will this affect your business, Mr. Basu. The other one is saying, this will affect your business. When I look at a broad definition that would allow that very tiny fraction of the Muslim community who already see, for instance, this is about prevent and pursue. This is about prevent and pursue in the government policy in those 2 areas, who already see, for instance, prevent as being a way of securitising the Muslim community and seeing the Muslim community through a counter-terrorism lens. I fundamentally disagree with that, but there is a small, very vocal, very well-publicised community that would effectively say prevent is a racist Islamophobic tool based on this definition. They will, I predict it now. I think you'll have seen there's probably been some commentary on it already because I won't accept it. So there is a definite link between those people using it for that purpose. Now that's fine for me. I'm an assistant commissioner and I wear all this braid and I've got broad shoulders and a lot of experience. When I speak to police constables and members of staff prevent officers who are going into large rooms where they're being heckled and called racist and Islamophobic for trying to prevent somebody going down that path, I'm thinking about them and their ability and their resilience to deliver that vital work that I have described as the most important pillar of this country's counter-terrorism strategy. I'm thinking about them. And then when I think about the other hugely emotional tool that we use, it's the Shed 7, it's the Schedule 7 stops at ports, and again that has been attacked as being effectively targeted and discriminatory already. This will add that small fraction of people who choose to use it. This definition will allow them to use this definition to say it's Islamophobic and racist. And what is really, can I just finish with one point, is by some people I deeply respect, senior members of the Muslim community, already think that by what I have said already in public, I have somehow said that my officers and their policies and their tactics are Islamophobic and racist. And I'm finding that very hard to live with, as though that somebody would think that I would lead an organisation that was that, but also that would be the natural conclusion for wanting this definition to be slightly tighter. And I need to say this on the record because they're all listening to what I'm saying right now. Islamophobia exists, discrimination and hate crime is disproportionately increasing in that community. That community and Muslim individuals do need confidence. They need people like me to believe them, and I need them to understand that I do. I just need this definition not to be so broad and ambiguous that it would give a tiny fraction of people who would pull this policy down, this contest, this national security policy down. I don't want to give them the ammunition.
Okay, I'm slightly alarmed that you think that a PC in Bradford could be browbeaten by the heckling of people who he may be investigating on issues around counter-terrorism.
Why are you alarmed by that?
No, let me finish. I'm alarmed that you think that could happen to one of your PCs abiding by these same laws under the same duties of care in Bradford, and yet if it was in front of you, you have enough braid for it not to be an issue. That's a problem of process, not of interpretation, isn't it?
I think my point, you might have missed the point. The point is I don't do that every day and that PC does. So I have to appear in front of those seniors, Dominic, whoever it is, to explain my point. I don't have to do that every single day. And what I'm most concerned about is that that door will eventually not be open to that person at all to go and explain their business.
But is that the case even though this is not intended and you would not want it to be legally binding? Would it be very different if it were legally binding? Because it's not clear from the report. It's entirely ambiguous, in fact, as to whether this definition is intended to be legally binding or not legally binding. How does that impact on your ability to enforce the law or enforce a definition which may lead to a criminal prosecution under the law?
Oh, I don't think it does. I think we made the point very clearly that we have racial and religiously aggravated offences, we have base substantive offences, and that's about enforcing the law. Some of the things that we do are not about prevent is a training. It's a voluntary programme to try and dissuade people from going down a path that might lead to a terrorism, whether you're a white supremacist or an Islamist jihadi. It is a voluntary programme, and in order to get into the community, for them to open the doors and open their arms and embrace that, that is a very difficult thing for that police constable in whatever community they are to get that kind of confidence. And if they are being told by members of, very small numbers but very vocal members that effectively they are Islamophobic and racist because they are targeting a community on that basis, that was my concern.
Okay, so are you saying that, as it stands at the moment, the law is sufficient, albeit being increasingly put under pressure by an increase in hate crimes of various descriptions, be it through the use of the Public Order Act of 86 or religiously aggravated assault or racially aggravated assault, that the law is sufficient to deal with these incidents as it stands, and having a definition that is as broad, as ambiguous as this, actually makes your job that much harder under the existing law?
So, yes, legislation is sufficient. I'm definitely not sitting here asking for more legislation. I'll quote my great mentor, John Grieve, you should never ask a police officer whether they need more legislation or not. They'll always say yes, which is precisely why you shouldn't ask them in the first place. But I'll be unambiguous. No, we don't need more legislation. We have a very solid and good legislation in this country to deal with this offence.
So why do we need a definition? Because you all agreed that we still need a definition, with the exception of Baroness.
I was very clear when I opened, is I think that definition is required by communities who feel under threat because no one's taking them seriously. So I think this is a community confidence issue. We already deal in policing with the criminal end of this very clearly. Martin's described it in terms of religious and racially aggravated hatred by the victim's own perception. But that can be anyone's perception, so our own officers make that determination. If the victim doesn't feel confident enough to say it, our own officers will do it. But we do that, we have to record it. It's mandatory now for religiously aggravated offences as well, which is why we're seeing such a rise in the Muslim community, because we know it, because we're recording it. And that isn't just about better recording practices, that is an exponential rise. And that is why they need confidence, and not having a definition where someone... I grew up in an era where people didn't talk about racism, and there was a lot of casual racism around. And it's the work of the people who fought things like the National Front that made it easier for people. I understand what it feels like to be abused on a daily basis. I understand what they feel.
Not legal enforcement, it's a matter of assurance for the Muslim community that they should have some confidence in the seriousness with which this is taken, one, by government and people in positions of political power, and two, by the police and other enforcement agencies. It's not a legal requirement. Do you agree with that, Mr. Phillips?
I think I agree with Mr. Basu's general proposition that, as I understand it, what he's really saying is that it would be helpful to have some clarity about what the law is. And I think a definition that made it easy for people to understand what the law actually is would be helpful.
Can you define, Assistant Commissioner, either what is Muslimness? How do you define Muslimness if you're faced with somebody who may be subject to a charge of falling foul of the Islamophobia laws? How would you define Muslimness?
I don't think, first of all, it's for me to define Muslimness. And I'm going to be investigating crime based on the law. An individual, as I said earlier, either an individual or any other individual, can assert that an offence was aggravated due to religious hatred, and they will provide the evidence that supports that. I think the important point, and I think when you read the report, the key point is that this has come from all the consultation with Muslim communities to come at a description that those people that were consulted agreed was the best way to describe Muslimness. I do accept that if you take that from the point of view of a police officer, it's not a term that most people would be familiar with as a term that they will have heard or used before. So again, that takes me back to the point about the additional clarity that could be provided to support whatever definition is agreed, could start to describe some of those aspects that describe that term, because it is a term that I had not heard before.
Do you think it's Muslimness as perceived by the perpetrator or the victim?
I think in reality it probably is both. The perpetrator will have a motivation for why he or she is doing what they are doing, and if that offence is either racially or religiously motivated, then I assume that is based on them identifying something.
To say that I have been under attack because of my Muslimness, then you say it's not for you to define. Well, you're going to be investigating it, though, aren't you? And if the perpetrator said, no, I didn't offend you because of your Muslimness, then presumably it's the victim that trumps, because it's his perception or his or her perception, isn't it? Well, I think... You've got to know what Muslimness actually is.
I think that's a highly unlikely encounter. I think what I would do, as you would do in any investigation, if somebody said to me, it's because of my Muslimness, I think the first question I would ask, well, in what sense are you saying that? and they will then give an answer which will either support or not support the sense that they have got that. The point about what the offender or the perpetrator or the suspect will say, well, clearly that is the essence of most investigations, where the suspect will deny that what he was doing was what we are suggesting he did. So again, you would be back down, and that would come down to what language that person used, what the circumstances of the offence were or the incident were, and that is the core of investigating. I don't think the term Muslimness prevents us from investigating. The point I would make is I understand from the report where that term has come from. What, again, I would say, and I think it's what Neil's saying as well, is about how you practically apply any definition alongside policing, and why I think some further description would assist.
It sounds like this is a recipe for absolute chaos, isn't it? If you don't even know whether it's the perpetrator or the victim's interpretation and definition of Muslimness, and you haven't even attempted a definition of Muslimness because it's not your job to do so, but it is actually your job to investigate whether or not Muslimness has been carried out in this case.
Sorry,
it's complete chaos.
No, it's absolutely not chaos. A victim, and with the legislation that we have around hate crime, the hate crime legislation is quite clear that the victim is, and any other person, can define that they feel that offence was motivated by whichever form of hate crime. That is the law as it stands. How that person chooses to describe their particular characteristic which falls under the legislation will always be different in every case. And in many cases you don't necessarily have a title. I wouldn't sit here and define Jewishness. There will be a whole range of factors that could come to define that, and there will be a whole range.
Terms are included in the law, are there? That's the point. So we're able to deal with it now without introducing this new term that nobody seems to know what it means with Muslims. Mr.
I'd like to be fair to the authors of the APPG report, they do have some explanation of what they mean by this. Anna Soubry said last week, as Baroness Falkner mentioned, she used as an example the way people dress. Well, the central case here is the case of Shabina Begum, Luton schoolgirl, who wanted to wear the jilbab to her school. The school already had a uniform which was, for most of the parents, 99% of Muslim parents, Sharia compliant, it was salwar kameez and so on. But she wanted to wear this particular form of dress. I was involved because we were asked to support the case, and we said not, because actually there were options, and there was a uniform and so on. But the point here is, if you define this particular form of dress as characteristic of being a Muslim, and Shabina Begum's QC, Cherie Booth, said to the House of Lords that not being allowed to wear this was a breach of her human right to religious...
Supreme Court.
Yeah, Supreme Court by that time, beg your
Court.
pardon. By that time, Supreme Court. A breach of her human right to religious expression. Now, my guess is, if this definition says targeting of expressions of Muslimness are a problem, then Ken Clark, a kind of bag, Emily Thornberry wouldn't want a woman in a burqa looking after her children, even Anna, a peculiar concept, wished women didn't do it, would all be guilty.
Could I say the Supreme Court found against...
Hang on, can I...
Shamina Begum, and in favour of the school.
Hang on a second, I'm just going to bring Stuart MacDonald in.
That's not really true, though. I mean, the definition requires that it's racism. You can make these distinctions and exclude certain forms of school uniform on other bases completely. It doesn't mean that that's motivated or is a form of racism, though, does it?
I wasn't the one who was saying that an expression of Muslimness related to dress. It's not my definition.
You're expressing concern that this definition would have you're expressing concern that this definition would have caught that. And
asked if expressions of Muslimness had any meaning, and I said that to be fair to the authors of the report, they have been quite clear that it does have meaning to them, and this is one of them.
Are you, just to be clear, are you saying that the school child that you've just referred to could have said this is Islamophobia under that definition? Because my reading of that definition is no, because it would not be. You couldn't possibly argue that it was motivated by racism or a form of racism.
Could I read it aloud to you? What they define as Muslimness, may I, from the paragraph? It says such an understanding of Muslim difference combines biological attitude, skin colour, with religious and cultural practices, including clothing, hijab, niqab, skull caps.
But you're missing the point. The
eating.
whole point that I'm getting at is that it's not just about expression of Muslimness. It has to be rooted in racism or a type of racism. You couldn't possibly argue that the school decision there was rooted in racism or a type of racism, could you?
It says or targeting. This is one of the possibilities.
That targets. So
I say again?
It says that targets. So it has to be a type of racism or rooted in racism. So a type of racism that targets. So you can't possibly say that the school in that example is being racist. That's
I wasn't referring to the school. I didn't say the school was being racist at all.
Yeah.
My point was about people. I simply made a point that as follows.
Are you not saying that this definition would catch that school?
Can I just take 30 seconds to repeat what I said? The authors of the report define dress as one expression of Muslimness. The definition refers to targeting expressions of Muslimness. And my point was simply that some people who, frankly, I think should be under no suspicion of being Islamophobic have said things about that form of dress that could conceivably, let's put it as mild as that, could conceivably fall under
I have some questions about
the rubric
this
of
definition
targeting that expression of Muslimness.
Yes, but it's wrong to suggest that definition would ever have caught the school in that example that you gave.
But I didn't suggest that.
Okay, well that's fine.
Okay, so
I didn't suggest
the school
that.
would not be caught by this definition. Toby Perkins.
Thank you. Baroness Falkner, you said previously that much of the response must come from existing criminal and civil law and guidance rather than the creation of new criminal definitions and categories. Now, you've heard, I think there's been widespread agreement from the panel that a new legal definition isn't what is needed, but you've heard representatives of the police say that if we can find an agreeable definition, it will help them to police Islamophobia, and also that it will give reassurance to the community. Do you believe that current hate crime legislation is sufficient, and do you believe that it is possible that the kind of definition that AC Basu advocates would be achievable?
I don't think it's for me to arrive at whether it's achievable or not, because they're doing the frontline policing. I'm not. What I do know is that there is hate crime. I know that because I'm actually interesting. I'm sorry Mr. Lawton has left the room, but I get reverse Islamophobia. So I am told that I'm not sufficiently Muslim, possibly because of the way I dress, possibly because of my demeanour, I don't know. But I get that, so I absolutely know, and I get it, frankly, too regularly for my taste. So I completely accept that there is a rise. I think when you have a rise in hate, you get a rise of hate crime. We are living in these times. Do you need a review of hate crime to ascertain whether it's fit for purpose? I'd be entirely content with that. I would have absolutely no trouble with a serious review, looking across the range of the stuff we've been putting into place for the last 30 years and seeing whether we need to do something more about it. Absolutely. I think that might actually be a very useful thing to do. I think the government's announced something. I'm not quite sure what it is at the moment. They want a couple of advisors. Perhaps a more comprehensive legal review would be helpful. That's why I mentioned the Law Commission.
So you... firstly, do you believe that current hate crime legislation is sufficient?
I don't know, because I'm not at the practising end of the law. I simply couldn't give you that judgment. What I see is the examples that they mention in their conclusion, and I say this because Madam Chairman raised the conclusions of the examples. What they don't say in those various really quite deplorable and despicable incidents is that many were successfully prosecuted. That's why we know of them, because they went to court and were successfully prosecuted. So it's not as if all of those examples happened and nothing was done about it.
You said that a definition that all Muslims would accept is impossible. Firstly, to what extent is the definition of Islamophobia a question for society, and to what extent is it a question for purely people who identify as Muslims? And secondly, do you believe that the increase in anti-Muslim sentiment in the UK can be tackled without introducing new definitions or provisions, whether they're sort of legally enforceable or not?
I think you go to the heart of the matter, Ms. Perkins. You've gone straight to the nub of the matter. Is it a question, a profound change in our cultural, legal, social understanding of a problem, which is what this definition entails, should not be a matter for 4.4% of our population? If you're going to embark on a culture war, then you need to have an informed debate across society about it. And I think it is not a problem for Muslims only. It is also a problem for those people who wish to dissent with prevailing views, who wish to disagree with opinion, who wish to disagree with belief. It should reflect all facets of society, and I think you've actually got it there completely. What do we do about anti-Muslim sentiment, hatred, and so on? There is clearly a problem. I think what we need to do, apart from the state, the government doing what it needs to do, public policy doing what it needs to do, I think there needs to be more of an attempt within educational institutions, more thought leadership across society, employers and so on, to look at why particular, and I'm speaking about Muslim disadvantage. I remember speaking in a debate in 2005 about Muslim women's pension rights because they were not employed in traditional employment. So I think there is absolutely a case to have a discussion as to why particular sections of our society suffer the level of disadvantage, not just that I think they're perceived to suffer, although I believe the perceptions are higher than the reality. Because, for example, Bangladeshi boys are doing now quite well at school. When I started talking about it, they were the last. They were the bottom of the pile when I first started talking about it. So you have seen change, but it has to be a society-wide discussion.
Debbie.
Thank you. Good morning. My question is very much about, do you view Islamophobia as a form of racism? Now, I know that Mr. Basu and Mr. Hewitt have already spoken about people being Islamophobic and racist, so I feel as if you've already touched on this already, and I know, obviously, Baroness Falkner, that you prefer the term anti-Muslim instead of Islamophobic, but I was wondering maybe if we could start with you, Baroness, in terms of, do you view Islamophobia as a form of racism?
Well, I know the subjects of Islamophobia are, on the whole, almost entirely of a different race, are a minority group, yes. So in that sense, I think the practical manifestations of it are usually directed towards people of my colour and other colour.
How do you respond for somebody who is white and Muslim?
A white convert? Yes, I think white converts suffer it because, to some extent, we've seen the examples in this report, and I know of other examples, and to some extent, people don't like, I think it's something very peculiar, that people particularly don't like their own community adopting the beliefs of another community. And one experience, of course, white converts experience it. So do, by the way, incidentally, in the US. I've given evidence to the US Congress on these issues. I've travelled on behalf of the UK government, under the Labour government, to France to speak about these issues. So I have a good global understanding of it. I have a lot of understanding of what happens in Germany. I think black converts in US prisons suffer it hugely. So it's not, we're not talking only of South Asian people of Pakistani origin, as the UK disproportionately seems to have. It's people all across the board.
Does that mean you would agree with that bit of the definition that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism?
It depends on how you define racism. I know there are people who define racism as including social class. I don't. I think, frankly, to be honest, if I can say this to you, I think people who look like me have enough problems living in a white majority country as it is, without worrying about our accents, our class, our socioeconomic privilege, or lack of, and so on. I think I'd like to see race in the mainstream definitions of what we define as race, rather than going into structural constructs of how it arises, what its roots are, and whether economics and class and other manifestations should rightly or wrongly be construed as race.
And Trevor, could I just put that question to you as well?
Well, we've said quite a lot in our submission, so I don't want to extend it. But I think, first of all, we shouldn't slip into treating race and religion as interchangeable. In this country, 1/3 of British Muslims are not South Asians, and over half of British Asians are not Muslims. There is a legal definition of race which is not compatible, and the Government Equality Office, I understand, has put out guidance on this. It is not compatible with the way this definition is framed. So I think that's the first point. Second point, when we first couched this report, this Islamophobia, in 1997, we specifically avoided conflating race and religion. And that was almost entirely because Muslim opinion at that time wanted not to be seen as a race. In fact, the point that was made to me again and again as chair of Runnymede Trust is that Islam is a pan-racial, pan-ethnic religion, and confining it into race was wrong. When we brought the Equality and Human Rights Commission into being, the Muslim Council of Britain resisted the idea of religion becoming the responsibility of the Commission for Racial Equality for the same reason. So, for most of my time involved with this, the opinion has been, do not mix race and religion. And if I may just finally say something, give a couple of facts about something that was raised earlier, about the nature of hate crime. The vast majority of hate crimes are race hate crimes. The Home Office data, which I just looked up, 71,000 in 2017-18 hate crimes were to do with race. 8.3 thousand were to do with religion. 76% are racial, 9% were to do with religion. And I think this goes back to the point that Baroness Falkner raised. What are people thinking of themselves as being? So I think it's really quite important for us to understand what we're dealing with here. And one last point, this may sound an abstruse point, but it's a very practical point. Racial equality turns entirely on treating everybody in the same way. Religious equality is exactly the opposite. We give people, for example, opportunities for holidays. Last year, Ramadan fell on in the same period as GCSE and university exams. Special arrangements were made so that students who were fasting did not have to do exams in the afternoon. If we start to conflate these two things, there will be practical consequences. This is not just a rhetorical issue.
Just thank you all for your time. Just final clarification. The anti-Semitism definition, notwithstanding the different origins and different histories of these definitions, the anti-Semitism definition is obviously used by a whole range of different organisations, including, as we know, political parties, to challenge prejudice, to challenge discrimination, and to challenge racism. Do you accept that a definition of Islamophobia could be used in the same effective and constructive way that the definition of anti-Semitism is used by
other organisations, not the criminal justice system, but more widely by other organisations to challenge prejudice, to challenge Islamophobia and to challenge racism? Yes or no?
Are you talking about this definition?
Yes. A definition.
A definition.
So we've had a lot of discussions, obviously, about the nature of this particular definition. A definition.
Yes. Yes, and just to help, Chair, our hate crime operational guidance, the definition is explicitly printed in that guidance to guide and go alongside everything else that we say in relation to anti-Semitism. So I think exactly the same if we were able to get to a definition.
And Baroness Falkner, yes or no?
Probably not, because politics is about disagreement.
Trevor Phillips, yes or no?
A definition could be used in the way you suggest, but it is very likely not to be.
Can I thank the panel for your evidence? We may, in the light of the second panel's evidence, come back to you with further questions, if that's acceptable. And I think finally, in terms of the policing thing, can I again just have clarification that in terms of any of your policing or prevent work or counter-terror work or any of those things, you already have obligations in terms of proportionality, in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of challenging racism and so on, and therefore all of those actually would apply equally in this area, and therefore again it would be possible to have a definition of Islamophobia that is completely in line with all of your obligations that you already have.
Of course. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your evidence. We'll move on to the next panel. Our second panel, and thank you also for listening to the first panel and the evidence given there. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves and the role that you play, and then once you've done the introductions, I will then ask you your initial response to the evidence that we have heard from the previous panel. Dr. Omar Khan.
My name is Omar Khan. I'm the director of the Runnymede Trust. So we published the 1997 report on Islamophobia that provided an account of Islamophobia. Then we published a report in 2017, a 20-year anniversary report, providing a definition of Islamophobia. And we also hold a secretariat for the all-party group on race and community, which has members of this House as members.
I'm Wes Streeting. I'm the Labour MP for Ilford North and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, and probably pertinent to the issues for consideration, I'm also the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on British Jews and a former head of education at Stonewall.
My name's Anna Soubry. I'm the Change UK MP for Broxtowe. I was born in Lincoln. I was raised in Worksop. My father was a Roman Catholic. My mother was Church of England. When they married at that time in the mid-50s, there was some prejudice towards Roman Catholics in our part of this country, as a result of which I was brought up in a home where religious tolerance was part of the Soubry DNA. I lost my own faith at the age of 14, brought up to Church of England, at the age of 14 when I went through confirmation. I take the view that accordingly I am a blank canvas in this matter, having no views whatsoever before I embarked on what I take to be a great honour as being the co-chair of the APPG on Muslims. And I'm a former barrister, so I'm rather inclined towards evidence.
Dr. Khan, could you give us your response to the first panel's evidence?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there I did agree with. I mean, I think it's fair to challenge definitions, any definition that's provided, and there are good reasons that everyone will disagree on issues that are obviously of great dispute. There were two issues that I'll just briefly say at the outset. I think partly in virtue of who you had invited, and the police commissioners in particular, the lens and the context was obviously hate crime and violence. And obviously, both from a Runnymede perspective, but also the APPG's report, one of the main functions, in fact, of the definition was to expand the understanding of the experiences that Muslims face beyond violence on the streets, to highlight the ways in which Muslims are disadvantaged in the labor market, the ways in which they face discrimination from the middle-class dinner table that Saeed Avarsi has talked about. So I think I would not advise that any definition of any social phenomenon should be determined by what the police think it should be. So I would say that of sexism, I would say that of homophobia, I would say that of racism. Of course, the police need an operational interpretation of said definition to do their work. But I would strongly disagree with the view that we should define any form of discrimination on the basis of a police operational definition. Of course, they need such a definition. But I think what both Runnymede's report and the APPG were doing was saying, look, there's a lot more going on here, and policymakers are too narrowly focused. In fact, one of our strong views is that the current policy framing of Muslims is too much in the context of securitization, and it doesn't look at things like poverty, and it doesn't look at things like the labor market, things that Trevor Phillips rightly highlighted. And, you know, insofar as we continue to have the debate in that space, it blinds policymakers from the wide ways and range of ways in which Muslims are disadvantaged in Britain today, and doesn't focus on those solutions, the things that we need to see. So that would be, I guess, the first concern I had. I mean, I have views about legally binding. I think that's being overstated. I mean, I think the case of the IHRA also has to make you a little bit, I think, how to put this. It isn't the case that the adoption of the IHRA definition has ruled out the practice of anti-Semitism. So adopting it, even by the Labour Party, hasn't sorted the problem. So I find it a little peculiar to say that the adoption of a definition would have that effect, when in my view, the adoption of the definition is merely the first step. So in that sense, I agree with Trevor Phillips again, which is the real question is implementation. So I find it quite odd, in fact, to declare that a definition would have those effects when I look at the effects. In fact, Britain has been a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which provides a definition of racism. 0 people have ever been taken to court underneath that definition. So I find it highly unlikely, given that we've been a signatory to that document for 51 years, that this would have those effects. So I think I'll stop there. I have further views, but the strong view that I have is that it should be... Sorry, that was the second main point I wanted to make, which is I don't agree with Trevor Phillips' account of how the definition and understanding of Islamophobia has developed over the past 20 years. I don't agree that that's what Runnymede's account... I can cite documents that we wrote in the early 2000s about this. It's quite conventional. I think it's really important for the committee to understand this. Whether or not it makes sense to the committee or to the wider public, I admit those are separate issues. It's extremely conventional within anti-racist, race equality, and academic discourse to define Islamophobia as a form of racism, and it has been for 20 years. There's absolutely nothing new about that. Now, I accept that there's a question of how you then translate that for policymaking, for public understanding, and that maybe more could be done around those cases in that sense, and I think politicians have a role. But it's really crucial that the committee understands that this is not internationally in any way being driven by some sort of Islamist plot, that it's come from nowhere, that it's unconventional. So I think you can ask about process of how the APPG went about its business, but its distillation of the academic and race equality view on this is absolutely correct, which is that Islamophobia is a form of racism.
So there are three, I think, major criticisms that I have of some of the things we heard in the previous panel, and we've been engaging since we published the report in both good faith and bad faith arguments against the report, and there are both. I don't understand how anyone in good faith could possibly read our report and draw the conclusion that this is an attempt to introduce some sort of backdoor blasphemy law. I mean, we could not have been clearer in the introduction in saying, let us be clear, the aim of establishing a working definition of Islamophobia has neither been motivated by nor is intended to curtail free speech or criticism of Islam as a religion. It also says criticism of religion is a fundamental right in an open society and is enshrined in our commitment to free speech. And in fact, I think through the examples that we set out, the whole purpose of the definition is to try and help people to work through recognising what Islamophobia is, how to not only recognise it, but then how to tackle it. And I don't see contained in our definition or any of the examples how anyone could reasonably suggest, for example, me saying that I don't believe the Quran is the literal word of God received by Muhammad, who I don't recognise as the seal of the prophets because I'm an Anglican. Oh, and by the way, I've got some pretty big problems with people who are standing on school gates in this country using Islam to justify bigotry and hateful language towards LGBT people. I can do all of that and believe all of that and consistent with our definition. The second thing is about legal enforceability. I'm not sure where this has popped up. I don't see contained anywhere in our report. I mean, there may be people who've given evidence who do aspire to legal changes, and maybe we'll identify some gaps in the law as new criminal justice legislation comes forward. But what we're putting forward is a working definition which can be used in a practical sense to help people to understand what Islamophobia is and how to eradicate it, because if we understand anything from social change in this country over the last few decades, it's that changing laws is one challenge, changing hearts and minds and practice is quite another. And if anything, this is about guiding practice and deliberation of examples that arise to help people work through sort of what Islamophobia is and where to draw the line. The final thing that I found really striking was the almost complete absence of British Muslims from any consideration offered by the last panel. They gave their own individual views, their own professional views, but at no point did they discuss what British Muslims are saying and how they feel until Kate Green's questioning, which brought in her experience of her own constituents. The fact is that hate crime against Muslims is on the rise. There are laws in place to tackle it, but clearly they aren't going far enough to help to educate out the prejudice. It is also the case, we went in with an open mind about whether to use the term anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia, and we found overwhelmingly, whatever the etymological roots of the word Islamophobia, Islamophobia is the word that is used most commonly and frequently by British Muslims, the term they found most helpful. And actually defining Islamophobia just as anti-Muslim hatred eliminates a whole range of other things that could come into play. I also found it quite extraordinary to hear Trevor Phillips say the definition was too broad and didn't address issues like discrimination in education, for example. Not only do we follow the IHRA route of giving some examples in general terms to highlight what we mean by Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness, we actually go on pages 57 to 59 of our report to give specific real-life case studies of discrimination against Muslims, which is more than hatred. It also includes the car insurance company that charges motorists £1,000 more to insure their car if their name's Mohammed. It also talks about the Social Mobility Commission's research that showed that Muslims are overall far less likely to succeed in the labour market than any other group due to rampant Islamophobia, discrimination and racism, the structural roots of Islamophobia as racism. So I'm very happy to engage with good faith arguments and consideration about the workability of this and how we tackle what is a genuine problem. But I do find it hard to believe that people have read the report once, let alone twice, if they continue to make assertions about blasphemy, about a legally binding definition, and worst of all, if they couch their concerns about this definition with absolutely no reference to the Muslim communities up and down the country, including those 650 national organisations from the Muslim Council of Britain to British Muslims for Secular Democracy, who have all endorsed this definition as something they sign up to, not least because of the process we went through in terms of deliberation and consultation with a wide range of actors, including, I must say, senior police officers up and down the country.
Anna Soubry.
I'd just add to that, because obviously I endorse everything that's been said by both Wes and Omar. The following. I am assuming that the committee will accept that we have now a huge rise in Islamophobia, and this is a very real, serious problem that affects the everyday lives of almost every member of our 3 million British Muslim community. On Friday, we had reference to the fact that I did a radio programme at a school in Buckinghamshire, and afterwards, as is the norm, we all had refreshments, and I stood with a Muslim father and his daughter. He had experienced skinheads in the 60s and the attacks and the insults and the abuse, which was quite prevalent for people of colour and of his particular faith at that time. And he was very clear that things had improved in our country until more recent times when they have returned. And not only had he experienced it, his son was beaten up in a burger bar for no other reason than his faith. One of his daughters had stones thrown at her. She was stoned because she chose to wear a hijab. I mean, I look at it and I see a silk chiffon scarf that's wrapped around her head, which I found actually quite attractive. But she was stoned as a result of the belief that she was a Muslim, which she is, and his other daughter, who I met, had also been abused and subjected to assault because of her faith. That is what is happening in our country today, and I'm sure everybody on this committee would accept it is unacceptable, but you can't begin to do the real work until you define what is Islamophobia. And as we heard from the witnesses, including my old friend Trevor and adversary Trevor Phillips, you know, for 20 years, frankly, everybody has ducked it. So that's why the APPG embraced this. And obviously I can't speak for Wes, he's more than capable of speaking for himself. But I have no doubt we really did enter this with completely open minds, which brings me on to my second point, was that as on that basis, we absolutely listened. We listened to not just the academics who are important, community leaders, people who frankly understand far more about these things, I admit, than I do, but we listened to the experiences of ordinary Muslim people going about their everyday lives. And this entire report is based on evidence. And having listened and gathered the evidence in an extraordinary, I believe, manner, and heard stories which frankly, genuinely shocked me, we then looked at how we got this definition together. And I'm reminded, because I'm old enough to be able to remember these days, when sexism was I'm not saying it isn't still a problem, but it was a particular problem. I'm old enough to remember and experience in my working life when it was not seen as something unusual for a man in a working environment to make a derogatory comment to a woman about the size of her breasts. I mean, I'd like to think that wouldn't happen nowadays because of the advancements that have happened in our society. As we understood what sexism was, began to define it. And equally, I'm old enough to remember when homophobic comments were seen as pub room banter and acceptable. And then as we began to explain it, to define it, we found, I hope and I want to believe, a profound change in the way and our attitudes towards gay people. And as Wes absolutely said, it isn't just about hate crime. And I really don't want to get us to get trapped in that and legal definitions. This is about building a more tolerant society. And the final thing I'd like to say, Chair, if I may, is about this issue of race. And for me, this is one of the most interesting and actually rather exciting pieces of work I've ever been involved with in the 9 years that I've been here. Because like I think many people, I started on the belief that, well, race obviously is something to do with your racial roots, or to deal with the colour of your skin, or whether you were born in France and therefore you're French, and somehow to do with DNA and all the rest of it. And one of the things that I put up my hands and admit I was absolutely educated about is the modern definition of racism, which has developed actually in recent decades. And it's not simply about biology. It is now far more than that, and it can therefore encompass people who are in a religion because they form a definable sect, caste, class, call it what you want, but the extension of the definition of racism now embraces people who are Muslims who are part of that faith of Islam. And it was therefore on that basis that we came to this definition after one of the most fascinating and challenging debates that I've ever been involved in, and I had no doubt about it. And finally, I would urge, if I may say, the committee, we've heard reference to Dominic Grieve, who of course put the forward to this piece of work, and I hope the committee will hear from him, especially in his role as chair of the ISC, because I think his views may assist this committee.
Well, you sort of answered my first two questions in your opening remarks, and that was around the reasons you've arrived at the definition, and also defining Islamophobia as a form of racism. I just want to ask you the third question, really, which is around the consultation that you undertook, and it's about how you sought to achieve a balance in your investigation. So if you could say a bit more about the consultation as well, that'd be really helpful.
So we consulted widely. We had firstly an open call for written evidence, which we published and tried to circulate as widely as we could. Anyone could submit evidence to our inquiry, and indeed they did. We list on page 61 of our report contributors to written evidence, and they include Muslim organisations, parliamentarians, a whole number of academics and organisations that you would consider might have a view on this. We also went around the country to ask grassroots communities what they thought in Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, London. On page 63 of our report, we list some of the key people who attended, not by no means an extensive list of every member of the public, but people who came because they had a particular professional interest, which, as I said, does include the Crown Prosecution Service and also includes senior police officers, I think up to Assistant Chief Constable rank. We also held a whole range of oral evidence sessions here in Parliament, and the contributors to those are listed on page 62. We did also engage with people of other faith communities as well, and also had an open questionnaire particularly aimed at victims of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. At the time when we put out a call for evidence, we weren't settling on one word or term or another, so we kept that open, and so we had submissions there from people describing their own experience, which are then found in the report. We also drew extensively on a very hefty body of academic work, which is listed in our bibliography over the course of about 2.5 pages in the report. So it was a very thorough process, and one of the things I've emphasised to government following the announcement last week, following the debate, that they're going to do their own piece of work. Look, I sort of make no bones about the fact that I think, I'm concerned by the government's starting position, really. I'm concerned that the government has already predetermined a number of things which I think are essential to understanding Islamophobia. They're precluded, for example, defining Islamophobia as a form of racism. It seems to me the government have accepted that the definition curtails free speech, which we don't believe that it does. I think the government should be more open-minded. But crucially, as I said to the Secretary of State last Thursday, it is absolutely critical that if government is going to propose to do its own definition, they have to do at least, if not a better job, of grassroots engagement with the widest range of voices on this, as we have done, because as I said, with some humility as a Labour MP, I have to say, given our painful experience on anti-Semitism, I cannot overstate the extent to which a Conservative government currently lacks credibility in the eyes of many Muslims to come up with its own definition, given how spectacularly badly the Conservative Party has failed to tackle Islamophobia within its own ranks. It's not felt that they understand Islamophobia, let alone are able to define it for others.
Yeah, I want to say something about that, because I don't think it's a party political point, which is that the proportion of Muslims who now vote for the Conservative Party is now below 10%. So the Conservative Party in the UK do as well with British Muslims as Donald Trump does with African Americans. So I think it's very dangerous for them to go into that community and say, it is equivalent politically of Donald Trump telling black people what they should think about racism. And I think they have to be very cautious in doing that. I did want to say one thing on the racism point, sorry, because I know you said you got an answer. One thing I didn't highlight enough is this is not unique to Islamophobia, as Anna has sort of hinted at, which is the conceptualization of racism has I would say shifted, but I think it's always been the case that racism was not just about skin color, right? So the origin of racism as an ideology is about justifying the economic domination of other groups. And to do so, there had to be kind of cultural justifications for why it was acceptable to treat people in those ways. And so there were always pathologies attributed to different groups, whether it was Gypsy, Jewish, Muslim, and Black. And the reality is that those tropes have been the same for centuries, right? So people don't just randomly pick up a trope. It's not like creatively they've come up with a monkey. That has actually been centuries of tropes about those things. So the point around hate crime is that it doesn't derive merely from the rising testosterone or the criminal aptitude of a particular individual. They're picking up within our society tropes that have existed for centuries, and those tropes are not about skin color exclusively. They're about what the racist thinks the ethnic minority does or thinks or believes. So there's nothing exemplary in that sense about defining Islamophobia as a form of racism.
The first panel, I didn't necessarily pick up that there was a huge disagreement with around the racism. It was separating the religious discrimination and the race one. But do you want to say
but racism is the belief that one group, race, is superior to another, and that other is inferior, and then it manifests itself in different ways. Yeah. But that is at its core, is that one group, one race is superior and another is inferior. And then the prejudice, the intolerance, often hatred, or just plain ignorance flows from that belief of superiority and inferiority.
And I think it'd be very hard to argue that the racist is motivated by theological considerations. I mean, it's not what's going on.
No, exactly right.
How would you respond? You've described very fully the consultation process and the engagement process, but how would you respond to a suggestion that the report might have been influenced by groups that were pushing perhaps hostile or surreptitious agendas? And I'm thinking of that question in the context of, I think it was Neil Basu saying to us that some people would use the definition, for example, to say that prevent is an Islamophobic tool.
Well, I mean, as with any definition on anything, or actually any legal framework, there are, what we can't do with the APPG is prevent people from using Islamophobia in bad faith as a bad faith accusation to try and silence others, in the same way that our common understanding of homophobia or biphobia or transphobia doesn't stop people from, in bad faith, accusing people of being homophobic who aren't homophobic. We can't stop that. But I would argue that that is all the more reason to have a clear definition with clear examples that's well understood and understandable to others. Look, and this is, and I have to, I think it's an important question, because that does bring us on to prevent. That charge against prevent is one that I would commonly hear in mosques in my constituency. And I think it's a shame that we constantly see the issue of Islamophobia through the prism of counter-terrorism. All I would say to the government on that front is that instead of ignoring those charges about prevent, I think there is a long overdue necessity now to listen to what communities are saying and to work with communities, because I think, especially when I talk to some of my own Muslim community leaders locally, what's often not written up in the story of counter-terrorism and the work that is done to tackle violent extremism are the stories of the mosque leaders who don't just have to deal with these guys who turn up. And, in Ilford, we've had some very high-profile examples of the sort of people I'm describing. These are the people who are physically wrestled out of mosques by imams and mosque leaders. They are a big problem for Muslim community leaders. And I think I don't want us to see the entire debate through the prism of counter-terrorism. I would also argue that if there is going to be something that strengthens the arm of those who incite people to violent extremism, it will be reinforcing the narrative that Muslims have no place in our society, that Muslims will never be accepted, that we're not interested in Islamophobia, that we're not interested in tackling the very real acts of not just hatred but systemic discrimination that Muslims deal with. So I would argue that a good understanding of Islamophobia, tackling this in genuine terms, is not just important in and of itself, it's also an important tool in tackling those violent extremists and the hate preachers who use those siren calls to bring vulnerable people to their cause.
I mean, we've been accused of being white, which we are, liberal, small l, which we are. And therefore, that is a criticism, and it completely destroys the validity of this report, which, of course, is a complete nonsense. As I say, the fact is we've come to it with open minds and open hearts. But I think if you look at the background of both Wes and I think you can take the view that, we don't get pushed around by anybody, and we are pretty brave. And we, most importantly, the voice that comes out of this is the British Muslim community. This is their definition, based on their experiences and their thought on the situation in our country as it is now.
I think it was unfortunate that Neil Basu said that, especially as the terms of reference for the independent review of PREVENT haven't yet been determined. So I don't know what kinds of organizations he was referring to, but we're one of 70 organizations who signed a report that went to the UN the High Commissioner on Racism, and 70 of us called for a review of PREVENT, including investigating whether it was racially discriminatory. And I guess he must think that all of 70 of those groups, which include mostly human rights groups, are however he described us, which I think is quite sad, really. And then, of course, the UN itself agreed with us, so he's also so describing the United Nations.
I mean, I wish people would put these criticisms in specific terms as well, because when they do, they're often found to be bogus. So, for example, one of the criticisms that's been made is that this definition has been influenced by CAGE, which is an organisation that I won't share a platform with, for example. Now, CAGE did send in written evidence, but they haven't adopted our definition. They don't support our definition. And we are no more pro-CAGE than the Home Affairs Select Committee would be if CAGE sends in written evidence to you. And that brings me, back to the arguments about the bad faith arguments against this report. People want to criticise the substance. Well up for that, and well up for engaging with it. But it's the bad faith arguments that,
I think also
force me to use unparliamentary language.
I mean, I've said this too. I mean, some of these organisations are actually opposed to the definition. So some of the organisations cited publicly as being behind it have actually come up with their own definitions and are opposed to what the APPG is saying and doing, which is particularly amusing, I think. But also, what I wanted to say as well is I think you can't rule out from the outset by definitional fiat that this is a form of racism. It has to be considered.
I don't think anybody is going to criticise the aim of and the intentions of what you're trying to do in this report, or to deny that there is a problem with hate crime generally and anti-Muslim hatred in particular. I think the concerns of this committee and others will be the definition that is the conclusion and the centre point of this report. So let's start on that basis. And I'm still not clear whether your recommendation is that your definition should be legally binding or not.
No, it's not a statutory definition. We accept that the definition as it's set out does not lend itself to being transposed into an Act of Parliament. What it is meant to be is a framework for deliberating, considering, understanding and challenging very real discrimination experienced by Muslim people.
Okay, so why, on the 17th of May, after the debate, did the all-party group tweet that the time has now come for a proper legal definition of Islamophobia?
Well, I've just said that the definition that we've proposed doesn't lend itself to being transposed into an Act of Parliament. That doesn't mean to say that...
You said it should be a legal definition, so what's the difference?
Well, I must say, to be honest, perfectly honest with you, Tim, I haven't seen that tweet, and it's not one that the way I would have posited what we're trying to achieve with the...
Wrong.
I would say so.
Who was responsible for it?
I don't know is the honest answer. Because
you're the co-chair of the all-party group.
Well, more than
the
one
all-party
person
group has put out a tweet. You're not aware of that tweet. Who's responsible for it? Because it completely contradicts the evidence you just
The honest
given.
answer is, Tim, I don't know. As I've said very clearly, and actually nowhere does it say in the report that we anticipate this definition becoming a legal definition. I do think that in the overall context of the law and how it is applied, I think there are questions to be asked about whether the existing legal framework is up to scratch and whether it is being properly enforced. That is quite a different and separate issue to saying this should be transposed into law.
You agree, though, of whether this should be legally enforceable or not is a pretty big point, and
yes, I do.
That tweet from your Twitter account of your party group is therefore misleading. So perhaps you'd like to identify why and by whom and how.
We'll go and sort all that out. We'll find out.
Would be helpful. So
it won't exist in a couple of hours.
If it's not legally binding, why do you think the current law is not working in terms of the various acts of Parliament, the various references which the earlier panel came up with, the Public Order Act, religiously or racially aggravated assault, which is applied and enforceable? Many of us might say it needs to be applied to more people, given the instances that are coming up. Why is that not capable of dealing with the problem as you now see it?
Well, can I ask first of all which facet of law? Which is it, the criminal law or is it the civil law? You see, this is the mistake.
This is the criminal law.
You see, this is the mistake that we've fallen into in society, is that we see things that we don't like as having to be institutionalised in some way in criminal law. In fact, this definition could be used to help guide our police officers, but equally it relates to the discrimination, to the prejudices, to the attitudes that people see in the workplace, which of course is often then in our civil law. And equally, as Wes gave the very good example of a insurance computer that doesn't hate, the computer doesn't hate Muslims, it's a computer. But when you put in a name and then you add Muhammad, it gives you a higher insurance rate. So this is why we said at the beginning, this is not about hate. I mean, I really dislike the word hate crime. And this definition is to encompass all the problems, wherever they may exist, of Islam and Islamophobia. Now, if we want to debate specifically crime, let's make that clear. But let's not misunderstand that the law is just about criminal law. Of course it isn't.
I did make that clear, that I was primarily concerned, and all the early discussions have been about the imposition of the criminal law by the law enforcement agencies. If you're going to say that this definition lends itself particularly to civil law...
No, I didn't. I didn't say that. I said it encompasses and it can be used... No, do forgive me.
No.
The whole point of this...
Well, I can't forgive you if you're going to deny what you've just said. You actually said that this could be used in the civil law.
No, I didn't say that. I did not say that, Tim. What I said is that this is a definition that can extend into all areas, some of which fall into technically civil liability, civil law. And the problem is with the attack that's been made on our definition, not just through the prism of counter-terrorism and all of that, but also through the prism, and forgive me, Chair, because it may be that you will invite people who come from employment law, from housing law, and so on and so forth. But it's all been seen through the prism of criminal law. And I think that is a big mistake. I'm just saying, for this committee to fall into...
You're just saying about people who are attacking. I haven't attacked it yet.
You had. I said that others have.
Right, you're conflating me with
this
all...
prism.
Okay, well, I'm not interested in what others are saying. I'm interested in what I'm saying and what you're saying in response to my questions. The point I was trying to make, that if you are saying that it does lend itself to the civil law, as well as all other things, not just the criminal law, then you'll have even more problems with the lower threshold of proof there as well. However, let's move on for that, because what I also don't understand is what your definitions are of the difference between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, as to why anti-Muslim hatred, or variations of that term, which have been put forward by other people, are not sufficient, why you have to have an Islamophobic definition in order to encompass everything you want to encompass?
Yes, so for two reasons. One is, in very simple terms, in terms of the word Islamophobia, it is the word that is most commonly used by British Muslim communities, and they felt that word was important and helped to shape their understanding. And I do think, I took real exception to what Baroness Falkner said in the previous hearing, because we have come to a view since the Stephen Lawrence inquiry that it is voices of victims of discrimination that ought to be forefront in defining it and identifying how we tackle it. But the second reason, this goes way beyond anti-Muslim hatred. If it were just the case that we were dealing with hatred, then that would be one thing. But what our report highlights, in general terms, but also very well evidenced terms and specific case studies, is a discrimination against Muslims which is systemic, is both conscious and unconscious bias. And, this goes back to what I was saying in my opening remarks, really, Tim, and why the law as it's currently shaped is insufficient. You can change the laws, but unless you change people's everyday practices, you don't change the lived experience of people. And we see this with LGBT discrimination. Yes, we've got the right framework in place. I think we've got pretty much, with the exception of marriage equality in Northern Ireland, we've got full legal equality for lesbian, gay and bisexual people in this country. Has that solved the problem? Of course it hasn't. How are we tackling the problem? Well, whether it's Stonewall's Workplace Equality Index, which puts in place a framework for employers to understand conscious and unconscious bias, the importance of role models and all the other areas that they grade employers on, or whether it's local community groups working with people who've been victims of hate crime to deal with their confidence and help them with careers progression, or to help them with accessing health services, for example. There are a whole range of social attitudes that need to change, a whole range of practices that need to change. And this framework is designed not just for legislators, but for all of those organisations that come into contact with Muslims, which is everyone, to help them understand what the problem is we're trying to tackle and how we deal with it.
Sure. So, if you didn't have a social problem, then you wouldn't really change the law because there wouldn't be any crime to prosecute. So I don't think we disagree with that. That's a statement of the obvious. So you don't agree with Neil Basu's claim that primarily we do need a definition, but for him it was not in order to change the law, it's in order to send out a reassurance, I think was the term he used, signal, to the Muslim community that it is taken seriously by people in government and by the law enforcement agencies such as the police. You disagree with his assertion that that's why it would be necessary not to change the law?
Well, I think it's, as I said, you can certainly, and we should, look at hate crime legislation, how it's being applied across the board and what that's doing in terms of the lived experience of people. But I think where I'd go slightly further than Neil Basu did, it's not just about virtue signalling and reassurance. It's not just about saying, oh, look, we've taken it seriously, here's a definition. It's about providing a framework and a toolkit for people up and down the country to look at their own, whether, if I'm an HR director in a firm, I might look at this in terms of my employment practices and ask a whole range of searching questions about the culture of my organisation, the experiences of my Muslim employees, and might put in place a whole series of changes to look at redressing any issues that I identify as a result. If I'm a coach of a 11-a-side football team for under 18s at the weekend, I might find this framework very helpful in addressing the difference between friendly banter on and off the pitch and language which is actually inappropriate.
Okay, let's come back to that, because the definition of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness is where this is a hugely grey area, isn't it? Who defines Muslimness or perceived Muslimness? And can you answer the question which I asked them earlier, where we appeared to get some conflicting answers? Is it the perpetrator or the victim's perception that is actually it's aimed at?
Well, I think it's the victim's perception of what's happened is obviously paramount, and I think we've established a clear understanding of that in the evolution of our approach to tackling hate crime. The reason why we landed on, as I say, we give a series of general principles in the style of IHRA definition, and then we also give some specific case studies to highlight what we're talking about. The reason why we landed on Muslimness or perceived Muslimness is that every other variation we looked at was deficient in one of two ways. Either it didn't cover the full scope of an Islamophobic attack, or it failed to recognise that people who aren't Muslim are also on the receiving end of Islamophobia. So, the guy in the Sikh turban, for example, who's attacked for being a Muslim because the racist attacking him is too ignorant to recognise the difference between a Sikh guy wearing a turban and a Muslim man. But also, for example, as happened in my constituency, if a brick is thrown through the window of a Muslim community centre and bacon is pinned to the door, well, that's not an attack on a Muslim. That's not an attack on a person. It's an attack on an expression of Muslimness, the community centre, which is designed, I think, to intimidate the people who attend. Okay. But the definition is designed to capture that.
We wouldn't disagree with that. But this is where it strays into free speech territory, which is something we are all concerned about. So if somebody says, I fundamentally disagree and I'm critical, in however inflammatory terms, of Muslims because of my belief in animal welfare standards and because of their disagreement with halal, or will be critical of Muslim laws around the treatment of women and gay people as well, because it falls below their threshold of what equality means to them. If they're critical of Muslims because of those particular things and others, would that fall foul of Islamophobia under your definition? Because those are Muslim lists.
No, and I would challenge you to point to the point in the definition where you would use the definition to shut down criticism on those grounds. I mean, I get loads of correspondence to constituency MP telling me to vote against religious slaughter. I don't think a single one of those people is Islamophobic or anti-Semitic.
Absolutely.
But I don't agree with them.
Well, I think some of them are.
Well, yeah, but in terms of but they're not silly enough to tell me in the email they send me. I'm a Jew hater, by the way. Can you ban their
this is the nub of
produce?
The problem, isn't it? If you've got somebody who regularly kicks their pet dog and cares not a fig about animal welfare,
exactly,
but because they hate Muslims for whatever reason, and they sort of hitch on that cause as a way of attacking Muslims, they will be Islamophobic. But somebody who loves their dog and doesn't eat meat or whatever, and is genuinely concerned about slaughter methods, that wouldn't be Islamophobic. So how on earth do you then define in those grey areas?
Firstly, context is everything. Secondly, I would challenge you again to point to the point in the definition that would preclude criticism on the grounds that you've described. And thirdly, one of the things that we did look at in our report on page 36, actually probably 35 to 36, was an interesting series of tests put forward by Professor Tarek Madood, who asked a series of questions, which I don't think that's perfect, by the way. I think we need some further tweaks. But this is exactly the kind of discussion and consideration that we ought to apply when looking at what's going on, and context is really
We all agree
important.
that none of this is a science, which is part of the problem. But where there are concerns about does this then impede upon free speech, and you have been at pains in the report to say it's absolutely not our intention to restrict free speech, but also in the report it states the recourse to the notion of free speech and a supposed right to criticise Islam results in nothing more than another subtle form of anti-Muslim racism. So free speech is fine, but actually if you're using it to criticise Muslims, then actually you're being Islamophobic and racist. So it's entirely contradictory and subjective.
Well, no, it's not. I mean, look, when considering whether a certain type of speech is a hate crime, for example, we look at context. So, for example, what's considered appropriate to shout at someone down the street would be entirely different to what's said on the stage of a comedy club. Context is everything, and I just think that if you going back to the definition, it is all about looking at context, the framework, and working out someone's motives. And by the way, I do think it is legitimate to question someone's motives if, for example, they have the most appalling track record of misogyny, think it's totally appropriate to use the kind of obscene language Anna was describing earlier, the kind of sexist language on their social media, but then reinvents themselves as a women's rights champion to criticise the niqab or the hijab or any other form of dress worn by Muslim women, I'm going to question their motives and question their sincerity.
I don't think this is a new problem. So you have it for existing law on race discrimination too. So Trevor probably has evidence of this when he was at the CRE or the EHRC. Lots of neo-Nazis put in claims of racial discrimination to the EHRC all the time, and the EHRC sort of takes them as the frivolous claims that they are. So I think there's always going to be the exercise of judgment in these cases.
When a well-known... yes, go on.
It's not just... it is context, but it's also intent.
Yeah.
Intent runs... If we're looking at criminal law, mens rea is a critical ingredient of all crime. And so, obviously, you look at the intent. So, for somebody to, like me, who thinks that the wearing of a burqa... I can criticise and make criticisms of the wearing of the burqa. And that is not Islamophobia.
I understand that.
Because what is my intention?
Right.
And then you look at somebody as... So sorry, it's just rather important. As Wes said,
I'm sure it's very important, but there are other people who want to bring in some questions. I want two last things, if I may,
Then you look at the evidence
Chair.
of that person to...
So when a well-known author says all Muslim... So when a well-known author says all Muslim majority countries are either dictatorships, despotisms, or countries where the army remains on standby at any moment to wrestle back control from religious zealots, would he fall foul of your Islamophobia definition?
It would depend what their intention was, and I would also want to know...
It's a fact, though.
Hang on, Tim. You see, so in trying to establish something, you would therefore look at that person's history to find out what their intent is, what the evidence is, of other things that they say, which may amount to saying, well, actually, when you put this in context, as Wes quite properly says, actually, I think this person is expressing Islamophobia. And equally, in looking at their context, their history, that individual's, you can say, well, this is somebody who is not... in that context,
because on the
Islamophobia, like
behaviour.
any statement from anybody.
So it has to be a pattern of behaviour or a characteristic of a person in order to fall foul of Islamophobia.
On the surface, it's a factually justifiable statement, isn't it? It is a statement of fact.
Absolutely.
In the same way, I've also
been criticised for Islamophobia.
Yes, but as I've said before, the mere accusation of Islamophobia doesn't necessarily make it true. In the same way that I see all sorts of bad faith claims of discrimination thrown about by all sorts of different communities to shut. So I understand the sensitivity of the issue and understand why people are anxious about free speech, but I don't think in good faith you could misuse the definition. You can try and abuse it in bad faith, but that's quite different. And and again, I've seen some of the good faith concerns expressed on exactly this specific issue.
But you can see the problems. This is not a science. This is a grey area.
But I can't point.
Can I have one last context?
Where is
Can I have one last context? Is it possible to have Islamophobia by one Muslim group against another?
No, I think that's sectarianism. I think that's a really serious and important issue in this country and internationally. I think it's worthy of deeper consideration. I think it is worthy potentially of government action. I also, by the way, think that there are some very serious claims and experiences made by people who describe themselves as ex-Muslims in terms of how they're treated by others. I think that's a serious issue too. I don't think it falls under this definition.
So Muslims who boycott the Ahmadiyya businesses, for example, and restaurants, who bully Ahmadiyya children at school, and who distribute leaflets calling for their death, that is not Islamophobia because it's by Muslims. But if that activity was by non-Muslims, absolutely, I think we'll all agree that it should fall foul of Muslim hatred, Islamophobia, shouldn't it? So is it possible or not between different Muslim groups for exercising the same activity?
I think that's a really interesting question. Well, again, it comes down to context, doesn't it? Because if people are discriminating, and I recognise the Ahmadiyya community as Muslims, so does the APPG, and we were proud to engage, and I recognise a lot of Muslims do not recognise them as the APPG. We do, and we've engaged with them on that basis. If Ahmadiyya children are, as you say, being bullied on the grounds of their faith, well, it may well come under the definition of Islamophobia. If it's by other Muslims, then I would think that would definitely come under sectarianism. And I think we've got experience in this country of both. I think it's an issue for Christians, isn't it, in Northern Ireland and Scotland and even other parts of the UK.
And definition is important, but obviously there is something to put onto that, which is whether it's right or whether it's wrong in any event, whatever definition one would put to it. And I just wanted to...
Yeah, but I think
exactly.
the point is not all wrongs are racism, not all wrongs are Islamophobia. So sectarianism is bad, wrong, and terrible and evil. But is it racism? Is it Islamophobia?
For the same crime with a different definition.
You're always going into crime again, you see.
I think you can.
Always going into crime. Can I just say something?
To move on.
Can I just say something which I really think is important? Somebody can make a comment and a woman may say, I think that's sexist. And then another woman might say, or indeed a man will say, well, I don't think it's sexist because of, I know this person, I know other things that they have said and so on and so forth. And it's strange. You can't have a lively debate. You can't then look at the intent. You can't look at the other evidence to come to some conclusion. But in any event, it may be wrong.
Chris Green.
Thank you. Mr. Streeting, do you agree with your Labour colleague Naz Shah in the debate recently when she said, if it is down to the experiences of women to define feminism, of people of colour to define racism, of Jews to define anti-Semitism and LGBTQ plus communities to define homophobia, in that sense, is it equally relevant or reasonable to say Muslims ought to define Islamophobia?
I very strongly agree with that. And actually one of the tests for us when producing a definition was to make sure not only that we consulted properly, but for us the proof of the pudding was in the eating, and how would it be responded to by Muslim communities. And the response that we had, with over 650 organisations locally and nationally supporting the definition, reassured us that the process that we went through and the sincerity with which we approached this was borne out in the response to it.
Wouldn't there be a concern? I wouldn't disagree with this. I think everyone in society, whether you're Christian in this context or atheist, whether in terms of LGBT rights, whether you're straight, whatever you might be, I think we all equally, well, not perhaps equally, people with a personal experience bring perhaps an additional contribution, but we all ought to be similarly concerned about discrimination of all sorts, and therefore surely it's not a positive thing to, in this instance of defining Islamophobia, to exclude 95% of the population from making a meaningful contribution.
I don't think it's about excluding people, and actually I can say with full confidence, having spoken to it in depth about this issue and other forms of equalities, I don't think that would be Naz's view either, that the views of everyone else doesn't count and it's only LGBT people's views that count, and there's no wider discourse. In fact, I can say from experience, having worked at Stonewall, that an important part of the job that we were doing was winning hearts and minds and winning people round and making the case and persuading legislators, sometimes who were frustratingly behind the curve, to get to the right point from our perspective. So it's not about excluding people, but it is, I think, as you might put it in your question, it is absolutely about elevating the views and considerations of the people who are on the receiving end of a particular form of discrimination, to elevating their views about how we define it and how we tackle it. And I think that's well understood, not just in this context, but in the evolution of our entire legal framework around equalities.
And in terms of the Muslim community itself, you rightfully say such a large number, such a breadth of organisations came together to contribute to this broad or vague definition. That's, I think, one of the points that Trevor Phillips made in his evidence is, I think, very interesting in the sense of the no platforming. When it was first introduced in the 70s, it was to stop fascists. In 5 years' time, it really morphed, it really changed into being a very different tool of exclusion. So at the moment, there's a very inclusive body of Muslims supporting this broad or vague definition. How will you keep as over a period of time, this definition or the interpretation and the understanding of the definition changes, which inevitably will, how do you ensure that you keep those 650 organisations on board?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't accept the premise of your question that this is broad or vague. I think that's the whole purpose of providing a framework and examples that underpin it. But I'm actually very well placed to...
Just on that point, once the definition is there, a very brief definition, I would suspect, should I say, that in broader society, that definition will be accepted, and most people, whether it's at a football club or other organisation, will not be reflecting on that report.
Well, firstly, I think we may have a present... Let me just be self-critical for a minute and then respond to your no-platform example. I think where we have potentially fallen short as an APPG is failing to recognise and highlight that the definition is made workable precisely because of the examples that underpin it, in the way that the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism... You'll remember the absurd position the Labour Party got itself into by saying the definition was just the first bit and we're ignoring all of the examples, or we're still trying to rewrite the examples. I think the same is also true here. So I will take it away as a piece of homework to reproduce our definition and examples, so there can be no question that the examples and the definition are one and the same and are absolutely necessarily together. The reason why I'm well placed to take on the no platform equivalence that Trevor put forward as a former president of NUS is that I am also a former president of NUS, and I won't be too unkind to Trevor, but some generations removed from Trevor.
Barely born when Trevor was president.
You said that, Anna.
And I know that because I was at the same time.
You said that, Anna. I didn't, and the record shows that. But I don't want to be on Trevor's Christmas card list. But the point is that actually the no-platform policy that Trevor would recognise and the no-platform policy that I presided over and put into the NUS Constitution were basically the same. There are a couple of minor changes. One is that for legal reasons, and this was a legal reason to stop the BNP from standing candidates in NUS elections, we tweaked the definition to include racists and fascists, but the bar was set very high. And under the umbrella of fascism, alongside the National Front and the BNP, we also included al-Muhajirun and Hizb ut-Tahrir. And sure, there are lots of other organisations that have introduced their own forms of no-platform policy. They do not bear any resemblance to the NUS no-platform policy.
And this goes to my point about the definition. I believe it's quite broad. The definition, once it's out there, the interpretation. So people, women who might be pro-life, will be no platform from a university because of their position. Because they'll be deemed to be an extremist and you shouldn't have those views on campus.
Because people have put forward a different policy.
And this
they wouldn't be doing it under the NUS no-platform policy in the way that, if people want to go away and produce their own definitions of Islamophobia, as they're perfectly entitled to do in a free society, and in fact some people have, and they hold people to different standards, well, that's up to them. They might even do a better job. Who knows? We'll be humble for a moment and assume they might.
Absolutely.
But actually, they'll probably do a half-hearted job. We'll end up in all sorts of muddy territory. But that will be their problem, not ours. This is the definition. This is the one that we have put forward. It is the one that has been adopted by the Mayor of London, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, local authorities up and down the country. The Scottish Government's looking at it. Every political party in the Scottish Parliament, most of the political parties down here have adopted it or are adopting it. And I really think that part of the important part of this process is in 3 stages. One is getting the consultation right. The second thing is getting the support for it amongst Muslim communities right. And the third is making sure this is the standard that is understood and accepted. So we don't end up with the mess that you describe, where people come up with their own definitions of Islamophobia, which do cross the line in terms of shutting down legitimate criticism of Islam as a religion.
Can I say something, please? It's also absolutely the case, and I speak as a lawyer, that if you look at the definition of all sorts of ideas, concepts, principles, whatever, definitions change, and interpretations of definitions change. There's a whole... There are mountains of books which record case law, which redefines, and indeed a very good example of that is the definition of race, which over the centuries and decades, again, has been changed. So, of course, the worst thing that can ever happen, in my opinion, is when in the danger that we are in now as a society is when we become over-prescriptive. And some of the worst laws, actually, that have been passed in modern times in Parliament, many lawyers and judges would agree, is when they are too prescriptive, not allowing for the nuances and indeed the changes and developments as society changes.
In terms of the public understanding, perhaps at some point policy making, but in particular public understanding, the understanding within the Muslim community itself, very diverse community. Many people have strong connections with Pakistan. Pakistan does not recognise as a country the Ahmadiyya community. Saudi Arabia has the Sunnah and Quran as its constitution, will not allow Ahmadiyyas to go on the Hajj to Saudi Arabia. Is it not reasonable to suspect or fear that over time this definition, which I would contend is quite broad and open to refinements in the years ahead in different communities, it is actually open to being quite divisive within the Muslim community, or how we would see the Muslim community, but some Muslims would not see everyone being included in that?
Well, I think we've guarded against that through the process of consultation and by engaging with the Ahmadiyya community, not just in terms of this work, but I think each of us, certainly my own constituency, I've got an Ahmadiyya community, not a huge one, a very small one in fact, but I engage with them as Muslims, I recognise them as such, I've definitely got more fruitful things to do with my time than to try and wade into a sort of a battle of Islamic theology and, getting into the different sects of Islam and who's right and who's wrong. As an Anglican, I happen to take the view they're all pretty wrong. But there we are. What you've described, though, is and return to, is, and I definitely don't make light of this, a very serious issue of sectarianism. And just as we have understood sectarianism in a Christian context in this country, I think it is long overdue for the Home Office and MHCLG to look at sectarianism in other faith communities. It's not just confined to Christianity or Islam, there are other issues too, but I recognise the anxiety here about the treatment of particular Muslim communities by other Muslim communities. I recognise that as sectarianism, in the same way that I recognise some of the abuse that's levelled at our Home Secretary, for example, describing him, amongst other things, as a coconut, because he doesn't confine to a particular expression of Muslimness from other people's point of view. I find that deeply offensive and wrong, and sectarianism, and it should be tackled as such. But I do make a distinction between a definition of Islamophobia and what we've set out, and a separate, but I think important and long overdue piece of work on sectarianism.
Thank you. Wes, you were at pains to read out the narrative about some of the kinds of behaviours you're not wanting to preclude and wanting to ensure that this definition doesn't in any way impinge upon legitimate freedom of speech and legitimate scrutiny. Nonetheless, there are those who believe the vagueness of the term Muslimness, expressions of Muslimness, perceived Muslimness, inevitably mean that people who are using and adopting the definition that you have here will be accused of Islamophobia. The list that you provided here in contemporary examples of Islamophobia, I'm assuming isn't meant to be exhaustive. There could be things that are Islamophobic that aren't on this list. You said in your analysis that a clear definition of Islamophobia is needed, and we've heard from others who say, yes, it is, but this definition is not it. How would you respond to the criticism that this doesn't provide a clear definition of Islamophobia, and that the term Muslimness is too vague to be helpful?
I'd have two responses really. One is where people think that the definition precludes language, behaviours, activities which ought to be permissible. I would like them to point to the part of the definition and the examples that preclude that, because often they don't. It's a general criticism, but not specific. But secondly, in terms of things that are missing, gaps, I think we'd be really open to that and really open to listening. And we recognise that, we went through an extensive period of consultation. We published a thorough piece of work. If people want the definition to be strengthened in some way, we would welcome examples of that, or clarified or strengthened. We'd welcome that. What I didn't hear from any of the critics in the first panel were any specific examples that fall into one of those two categories. I thought it was astonishing, actually, that people would come before the Home Affairs Committee and criticise in such general terms, but not offer either specific examples or indeed specific solutions, because that's the responsibility. We know we've got a problem. We heard from the first panel that there is recognition there's a problem. So what do they propose? Each of the individuals you heard from in the first panel have some degree of professional responsibility for tackling this problem, and I could not believe that not a single one of them had a practical suggestion to offer about what they will do to improve the lives of British Muslims.
So I mean, in terms of the specific kind of charge that the term Muslimness, targeting expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness, is too vague, what would be your response to that? Are you saying that your response to that is if it's not listed, it is not Islamophobic?
Well, as with the IHRA definition, the examples that go alongside it are absolutely critical for informing our understanding, and every example that arises, you have to consider it in context. For example, I'll just sort of pick one at random. Holding Muslims collectively responsible for the actions of any Muslim majority state, whether secular or constitutionally Islamic. Tim Lawton's already given an example of someone who is a credible academic who has made criticisms of those Muslim majority states which are grounded in fact and evidence, and I think are actually indisputable as fact. The difference would be if I then pick on my Muslim mate walking down the street and saying, what are you up to in Iran now? What are you going to do about this? Or, I suppose you're supporting your mates in Saudi Arabia, are you? You've just beheaded a load of people in the biggest mass execution in Saudi Arabia's history. That would be the distinction. I've got I've been here a very short length of time, relatively. I've got a pretty long record of criticising Muslim majority countries and of criticising individuals in this country who use Islam and Islamic theology and teaching to persecute others. All of that is done in good faith. None of it breaches this this definition. And as I said, as an Anglican, I can also get into a broader theological debate about my differences with Islam, none of which would make me an Islamophobe, and all of which would be perfectly permissible under this definition.
I take that. You were saying previously that there can be an attack on Muslim that isn't individuals. You gave the example of attacking a place of worship. Now, one of the expressions of Muslimness that many people might recognise is the ways in which they worship. And there might be many others who would say in our society we would see the ways in which they worship as sexist. I went recently to speak to those who worshipped at a mosque in Chesterfield shortly after the Christchurch attack as a sort of mark of solidarity and support and to engage. But every person I met there was a man. There was no sense in my engagement that the people that I was engaging with felt the fact that I was only meeting men was in some way restrictive or limiting. So in terms of the way that many people would recognise expressions of Muslimness, the way that Muslims worship would be an example of something that might be criticised, and people would be anxious that they weren't that they were in a difficult place where they would say that recognising the ways that Muslims worship might call them see them being classed as sexist under our kind of gender equality. So I just wonder if you could sort of expand upon that and how you see all of that in this context.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing is that I can't find anywhere in this definition something that would preclude me saying, as I have done in the past, that I find being in gender-segregated spaces uncomfortable.
Absolutely right.
In fact, when I was president of the National Union of Students, I addressed the Federation of Student Islamic Societies conference. I don't know what the practice is now, but certainly then it was gender-segregated. And we were talking about freedom of we're talking about exactly this issue, freedom to criticise religion. And one of the things I said is, look, I don't mind saying that I find being in a room where people are separated by gender deeply uncomfortable. I respect this is your space, this is your conference, and it's for you to decide the rules of the House. But I don't like it, and it doesn't sit comfortably with me and my views on gender equality. That doesn't make me an Islamophobe. I think where I think there would be a challenge is if you're applying double standards by requiring of Muslims behaviours that are not expected or demanded of other groups. Because, if I walk into one of my synagogues, for example, there's gender segregation at shul. And I just think sometimes it goes back to what Dr. Khan was describing in terms of complaints that are made into EHRC. There are loads of people, I'm sure, on the far right who regularly bombard the HRC with complaints about mosques and gender segregation. I wonder how many have done it about synagogues. Well, actually, being from the far right, and now I've said this, if they're watching, they'll probably get some complaints in there because they don't like the Jews very much either. But the point is, I don't think there's anything in the definition that precludes that kind of criticism and saying, look, I respect that this is the teaching of your religion, this is how you practice your faith, but I find it uncomfortable for these reasons. I think it is all about context. If I choose to then insult a whole load of people or abuse them in some way, I think that's a different kettle of fish. But merely critiquing, offering a different perspective, a different point of view, is part and parcel of living in a liberal democratic society.
I feel like I wrote a piece in the Times 2 years ago saying criticizing ideas is the hallmark of a free society, but discriminating against people for their background is a sign of an unjust one. And I feel that this point around free speech I've made for 20 years, that of course we can criticize ideas, and I've gone into mosques, I've talked to people, I've said that this is what needs to be required, and I've had very little, almost no pushback on that. So I do think this issue is understood, and I do understand, I fully understand why there's an issue, but I do feel there's more effort to talk about how far we can criticize Muslims than there are to attend to the question of how to respond to their discrimination. And if the government continues to resist a definition around racism, the view will be that they're kind of continuing having that dispute, which is genuine, but I think very few Muslims would disagree at this point. I mean, that you can have the debate. I agree there will be different views. Of course there's conservative views, and we need to challenge sexism and homophobia, and Runnymede has a long track record of doing that. So I think it's one of the advantages, though, of seeing it as a form of racism. One of the things I feel quite strongly about is that non-Muslims haven't come on board enough to challenge Islamophobia, and part of it is because they haven't understood it. They've seen it as a sort of free speech faith issue rather than a discrimination issue, which is one of the reasons I think pushing the definition that way is advantageous. How you analyze a problem is both then reflects how you respond to it. And I think so far it's not just public policy, frankly, but even anti-racists sometimes who've misidentified the nature of what Islamophobia is and misidentified the extent to which the discrimination they experience is similar to other groups. And so one of the advantages, I think, is it places it within a wider human rights and equality framework that can bring on board a wider platform of allies and can also make demands then not just in terms of what you in this committee or what government or what the private sector is doing or the police for that matter, but all of us, and I would like to see more work across society to challenge Islamophobia, uniting Muslims and non-Muslims. And to the extent that a definition is there, I think it has to have that function to help public understanding, to understand the nature of this problem so that we have a better solution to it. And the solution should not be on blasphemy or free speech because that's not what the definition is about. The solution should be on attending to discrimination and disadvantage. And that is what all definitions should be doing, and I think the APPG definition succeeds in that.
Stuart MacDonald.
So the evidence has been very helpful so far, thank you very much. So just a couple of final points. Essentially it seems to me that there's like a two-limbed test here. First of all, there's racism and it's targeted at Muslims. Is that basically it? And if so, why has a definition sort of introduced this concept of Muslimness, and why does it sort of seem to be equivocal about the relationship with racism, Dr. Khan in particular? Well, I would say racism targeted against Muslims or people who are perceived to be Muslim.
Yeah, I mean...
Because it's also about mosques. So
yeah, I think it is mainly about people, but it is also about representations of Muslimness. It's not my definition, so I kind of feel they should defend that on those grounds. But I don't want you to take that as me saying it doesn't make sense. It's not my definition. It's theirs, right? So, but I understand where it's coming from, and it's not. Again, it is in the literature and the understanding of it. It didn't come from absolutely nowhere, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that. We say it's a type of racism and it's rooted in racism because we understand that it isn't classically what people think of as racism. And also we don't want to distract from actually what is that common understanding of racism, because that's important too. And, you know, we certainly haven't solved that problem. But we wanted people to understand, and we knew we were sort of advancing the sort of dial here a bit, that by simply saying it's a type of racism and rooted in racism, we were opening a debate and we were going to have to explain and justify it because it doesn't fall into what people would naturally consider. And that's really important for developing an understanding of the sociological context of racism and race as a social construct.
For a second, Stuart, I'm conscious that Tim may need to go, and Anna, I think you wanted to come back on the issue about the tweet.
Yes, I just wanted to say that in relation to the tweet, and it's always helpful when people actually read the actual tweet as opposed to read a briefing that they may have been given. A tweet was put out by the APPG on Muslims on May the 17th, which was a clip of myself asking Victoria Atkins, Home Office Minister, in March 2018, before we embarked upon the definition of Islamophobia, asking the Minister if a legal definition wasn't required, to which the Minister replied it wasn't. So it was not a tweet in the way that has been described to this committee. It wasn't the APPG saying we need a legal definition. It was me asking a minister if we needed it, actually before this work was embarked upon. So I hope that clears it up.
To Stuart MacDonald.
Okay, so I get the importance, in fact, of introducing that this is a form of racism or being rooted in racism. But what about the need for introducing this concept of Muslimness?
Yeah, well, that's it, because it is broader than people, isn't it?
I mean, isn't Anna Soubry talked about an attack on a building, for example. I mean, isn't that still an attack on? It's a racist attack on people, even though immediately the building's not been attacked for its, as an end in itself. It's to get at people still.
It's the expression of the activity. So and that's why, I mean, we did have as I say, a really good long debate about this idea of Muslimness. And one of the things that it does is that it captures that incident of when somebody puts bacon on a handle of a mosque or a Muslim community centre. And whilst I accept that the intention obviously is to offend and upset people who use that centre, who may or may not be Muslims, I thought we really thought that this idea of Muslimness captures an attack on a building which would otherwise not fall within a definition if it was simply looking at attacks on people. So we kind of like that it encompassed all this other activity as well, to see it for what it is.
I mean, let's imagine that I bought a truckload of copies of the Holy Quran and I decided, sort of apropos of nothing, to set fire to them in the middle of a public place, or even in my own back garden, and to put the video on social media showing that I'm burning. Now, that is I guess that might fall under, I'm not a lawyer here, so I'll tread carefully, but that could fall under incitement. It would certainly be gratuitously offensive. There are no individual victims of crime here. I've not stolen someone else's
it's not a
copy.
crime.
I've just done something and I've just decided to be provocative. And the point is that if we're serious about tackling prejudice and discrimination against Muslims, it is about establishing an understanding that extends beyond the confines of the law or things that would always be prosecuted, because it is about creating a society in which we live alongside each other, not just with tolerance but with respect, and understanding that you may well, I mean, even with this definition as it is, there may be things that people can still do.
Nitpicking slightly, because
but you wouldn't answer polite.
Yeah, there's a sense in which I thought actually you've made it slightly more complicated than it needed to be, but I sort of get from what you're saying what you were driving at, absolutely. And I think I absolutely welcome the sort of introduction of the concept of racism to this, because I think it gives a powerful understanding of exactly the nature of the issue that we're having. But on that point, Dr. Khan, you spoke about how this had really been in the mainstream of
So I mean, Tarek Madood in the 90s, but also, I mean, Runnymede from the early... We have a report from 2000 that's quite well known called the Parekh Report that Jack Straw launched as Home Secretary, has a section on anti-Muslim racism, and there was a follow-up to the Islamophobia report that... Yeah.
Other previous definitions of
yes,
Islamophobia,
yeah, we have
none
one.
of them had actually mentioned or explicitly used the word racism, so I was just wondering why that was.
No, we have as well in 2017, our report. Our definition is simpler in that sense. It just says Islamophobia is anti-Muslim racism. So that's our definition.
It seems to have a slight equivocation about it, because it sort of says rooted in racism or a type of racism.
Yeah,
it's almost
no, that's
akin
yeah.
to racism.
That is the AP. So Runnymede Trust has published a report in 2017 that has a slightly different definition. So obviously the APBG came later and had their definition. I understand what they're trying to do with rooted in racism, because it is a little counterintuitive to a lot of people. I mean, people say things to me all the time like Islam isn't a race, Muslims, there's no such thing as a race of Muslims, which, I mean, everybody knows that, right? Nobody thinks that Islam is a race. So these are very bad faith arguments in my view, but I can understand that the public understanding of what racism is, it doesn't necessarily track how sociologists and race equality think tanks write about this. So I can understand why there's a slight kind of rooted in racism to try to bring people along. I mean, I think from my point of view, it is simpler to say Islamophobia is a form of racism, and that's what I would say. But I understand what a public policy document is trying to do. And the key thing to me, and it gets back to Tim Loughton's point, is that you do need to go beyond hatred. Because I think it minimizes not just the public policy response, but the public, the wider public. They need to understand that it's not just a few bad egg Tommy Robinsons or a few neo-Nazis, that Islamophobia is extended much more pervasively across society, and we may be picking up Islamophobic tropes, all of us individually, without even knowing about it because it's so entrenched. And I think it misses out on the sort of strong evidence on CV studies, which shows that Muslims have an additional penalty to other ethnic minorities as well, in addition to... So I just think it speaks to that. But there's I accept there's some way to go to get the public. But I would say there's a wider problem, frankly, in understanding what racism is. And I think the public, I mean, it's 20 years on from the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report, still don't understand what the concept of institutional racism is. There's still controversy around that. And you had the police here earlier. So I think there are some bigger challenges of understanding racism, and I think the report was trying to sort of signal to that a bit as well.
I just thought that the Wezzer's example was really important about how the burning of a whole pile of Qurans in your back garden is Islamophobic, but it isn't a criminal offence, and we don't seek, because we say it falls within the definition, to make it illegal unless it goes against some of the existing laws about clean air. It's really important to understand that.
Thank you very much for your time. I just ask you just quick final clarifying questions. Just first of all, in terms of the APPG position, just clarify that, do you see the definition as including the examples?
Yes.
And in terms of, you've given some very sort of clear and strong examples in the course of this evidence, both of what Islamophobia is, but also what Islamophobia isn't. And you also, and Stuart MacDonald did in terms of the question of Trevor Phillips, you had other references throughout the report of what it isn't, and you refer to Professor Tariq Madood's examples of what counts as reasonable criticism and so on. Did you consider including as part of your definition, as part of your examples, an example that shows what Islamophobia isn't, or did you decide that that would be counterproductive?
I think it's an interesting question, and also one that's arisen in the context of the IHRA definition. I think that the point is that you have to measure every example up against the positive tests that are set, and the definition with the example should help people provide a framework for helping to recognise what is genuine Islamophobia and what is kind of false flag allegations, or frankly what may be uncomfortable or even impolite but doesn't meet the test of Islamophobia. And I think as a society we aspire to politeness. I'm not sure we can create a code of practice for politeness, and I think that's why you've got a clear definition which actually sets a slightly higher bar and a framework against which any individual example can be judged.
Consider whether, so as to avoid some of the misinterpretations that get thrown at you, there was anything that would be an example that would diffuse the misinterpretations, because you've given quite a lot in the evidence.
I think actually, to be fair, in the report we do address these issues, which brings me back to the point that there are, I think, lots of questions or points of view that have been raised in good faith about this definition, and we're really keen to engage on those. But I have to say there have been a huge number of bad faith criticisms made, often by people with their own disreputable track record when it comes to tackling not just Islamophobia but other forms of prejudice too. And I don't understand, as I said at the outset, how anyone in good faith can claim to have both read the report and concluded that it's either a backdoor blasphemy law or that it's meant to be legally enforceable. And certainly they don't seem to have spoken to many British Muslims about their understanding of Islamophobia.
And forgive me, but I may have not heard it, but I've not heard any evidence as to how this definition prevents the police from doing the job that they do to keep us safe. Because if you are stopping somebody on the basis that they are a Muslim or they look like a Muslim, that can't be right.
Yeah, and don't blame the definition for your discriminatory policy. I mean, we know the police can be discriminatory. I was quite, whether or not Neil Basu is personally racist is irrelevant. I mean, the question is whether the police's policies result in discriminatory outcomes for different ethnic groups, and we know it has. So I find it quite troubling that a senior police officer would seemingly deny that the police service is, even till today, operating in such a way that leads to discriminatory outcomes. And in terms of Schedule 7, which he cited, even David Anderson has raised concerns about the application of Schedule 7. And you'd be hard-pressed to describe him as a sort of advocate for, he was the reviewer of this pieces of legislation. The other point I did want to say is I do think it's really important, and that was the sole aim of us giving a definition. It wasn't the intent when we wrote our report either, was to get a definition down, and it's become sort of where the debate is. And I think what really needs to happen is we do need a definition, but we need to move from the semantic debates to taking action. And the policies need to be developed. And one of the reasons it can't continue to talk about hate crime is we can't avoid hate crime. It's hugely important. And I don't want to minimize the terrible consequences for people's lives. But if we make a definition that narrows us to hate crime, if it narrows to the policing operations, we're just not doing what British Muslims expect in terms of the experience of discrimination they have in their daily lives. And it'll be a total missed opportunity if we're still having semantic debates a year from now rather than seeing the action on the ground.
My final question to you, Dr. Khan, was that this is obviously, we have devoted this evidence session to the definition. We will have a series of further evidence sessions. You made a very strong argument about discrimination needing to be at the heart of Islamophobia and not simply seeing this as around hatred or hate crime. So, which leads me to, I suppose, is to two final questions. The first is, given what the government has said it now wants to do around the definition or appointing the advisors, given to what I think Neil Basu recognised, that there is now a kind of problem in terms of further anxiety and concern at the rejection of the definition among Muslim communities across the country. So the question is, what should the government do next specifically on the definition in order to rebuild that confidence and to get to a positive outcome? And secondly, what is the best way for us to actually put discrimination at the heart of this rather than it simply being seen around a hate crime model?
question. I mean, I definitely think they should start by engaging with the APPG. Obviously, they've done all the good work they've done. I think they shouldn't be ruling out by fiat from the outset the idea of racism. It's fine if they... I mean, I disagree, and I think the evidence goes against them. And as I said, there's also good policy and public understanding reasons to use racism as a concept. But ruling out from the outset certain kinds of considerations from those deliberations about the definition strikes me as not leading to where we need to get to. And it doesn't send the sort of signal to the community either. I mean, from 1965, I've spoken to the authors of the 1965 Race Relations Act, and they knew it was a weak piece of legislation. But the main purpose of that piece of legislation was to signal to ethnic minority communities that they had heard that racism was happening and the state was going to respond, and to signal to the majority community that this was no longer acceptable. And right now the state is also signaling by saying that Islamophobia isn't a form of racism. It's signaling both to Muslims that it doesn't think that what Muslims think Islamophobia is real, or is racism rather, and is signaling to the majority that this is, not really a significant problem for all of us. So I think they have to think a little more carefully about that, and the appointment of those independent advisors will be very crucial, I think, as well. But I think if the process excludes